감사합니다. I want to go to the Somran.
Yeah.
Somran. Where's Somran around here? Somran.
아무리
Somran.
소프라노.
Somran.
소프라노.
Where's Soprano? Soprano.
소프라노.
Soprano. Where?
Do you know Japanese girl?
Japanese girl.
I want to Japanese. You can
I want to Japanese girl. Where's Soprano? Soprano.
소프라노.
I want to go.
소프라노.
Soprano? No, it's close. Open.
じゃあモネホニガで喋ったらいいけどと思ったんで。
Can you speak English?
イギリスとジャパニーズ語。
Can you speak English? So where's the Soprano? I want to go there. I want to visit there.
忙しい。
Oh, you can speak English. Okay, thank you. ありがとうございます。ありがとうございます。
すみません。
すみません。I'm looking for Soprano.
So you're also looking for Soplan?
Soprano. Do you know where is the Soprano around here?
I know, but no exactly.
Why?
Do you know Anaijo?
안나이죠, no.
Anaijo is
It's far?
No, not so far. Anaijo.
Yeah. Your pay, no video.
Yeah. Yeah. So where is the Soprano? Around here.
Anaijo is a place.
So name?
Anaijo.
안나이죠.
Anaijo is a place. Guide you to Soplan.
Oh, 안나이죠.
I think some Anaijo is open.
Open, some open, but some closed, right?
Yeah.
So where's the 안나이죠?
But I think this time
Usually closed?
almost Anaijo is closed. No, closed and foreign.
No foreigner? No, bro, please, no foreigner. Don't do that. No foreigner, right?
Almost so I have no idea.
Can you turn off the Africa? On streaming on Africa? Turn off the on Africa? Purple pepper. So where is the Soprano? Just 안나이죠.
Anaijo is like
I know.
like this.
So where is that?
I think go straight.
Go straight? Turn right?
Right? Straight.
Straight. 안나이죠 there. Thank you. They gonna guide me.
No?
Yeah, arigato.
Oh, you gonna leave? Okay, it was nice.
It was very
Did
nice
you?
meeting to you.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, maybe if you're going to America, maybe I will see you in America.
You go there.
Maybe.
Oh
But if I will, I don't know anyone in America.
Yeah.
If I will go there, I need to find someone who I can
Yeah.
speak with.
Maybe
So if I will find someone, then I will come there.
Okay.
No problem.
Nice. Maybe Deepak there.
If Deepak will come, then definitely I will come.
Yeah. Thank you.
Have a nice time and be safe.
Have a nice day.
Be safe. Good night.
Everybody gone. Yeah, it's our time.
Yeah.
Soprano.
Yeah.
Why you are laughing?
Yeah. I'm enjoy.
You want to enjoy yourself.
I'm enjoy 똥파리 flying.
Yeah. Okay. So, it's like you just need 3 minutes, right? For Songman, you just need 3 minutes. 3분. Yeah, 3분. 5 minutes? 5분? I can wait for you
Oh, very
outside.
very little.
Very little?
Yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes. 10 minutes? Bro, you're liar. Yeah, you liar. You liar. You enough. You just, the 5 minutes enough for you. 5 minutes enough for you.
I'm running time.
Yeah, you are running time.
Sorry.
30 seconds.
Concept.
Yeah, you are running time. 30 seconds. Yeah, you are running time. 30.
No.
No. 30 seconds.
Why?
Proper paper! One more reset, please! Oh, what the fuck? Oh, wow. Okay, what do you want? Shout out to Proper Paper, guys! What the fuck is this? Why don't know? Oh, Proper Paper, 50 sulfur for reset!
All right, welcome back. So today we're going to continue on with some of the synthesis stuff, looking at some more kind of synthesis types and kind of history of synthesis, that kind of stuff, basically. So historically here, here's one of Bob Moog's early systems. This is Moog System 55, modular. And in the early days, all these synths were essentially considered modulars, and meaning that we had individual components, right? So all these kind of things we were talking about the other day, those would be individual sort of modules within a cabinet like this. You get this cabinet, essentially it's just going to have power in the background, and that's it. It's just basically a powered cabinet. And then it's up to you as the user to say, all right, cool, I'm going to go output of my oscillator into the filter, output of my filter into my amplifier, I'm going to take the output of my keyboard, plug it into my VCO, output of my keyboard, plug this in my envelope generators. But all those kind of things, individual sort of function generators we're looking at the other day, are all individual sort of modules within here, right? And back in these days, of course, setting out for a catalog, right? Look something like this, and you're essentially, most of these systems are all custom that you can be like, all right, I want 3 VCOs, maybe I want a multi-mode VCF, I want to dedicate a low-pass VCF, maybe I want a sequencer, ring modulator, all these individual sort of function generators that we've got on here. So, but yeah, like I said, mainly custom built and very much up to the user sort of how they're going to sort of integrate all these little function generators, and also just going to be sort of what's within their particular system as well. So. And by contrast, here's one of the Buchla systems. This is actually one of the newer, probably like early 2000s about. And yes, it looks like a spaceship. Yeah, very much so. And that's kind of the Buchla stuff. It does very much look a little different. And a lot of the Buchla stuff has also a lot of different kind of functionality. So depending how we patch things, they can actually do different types of functions within there. But it's pretty cool. And yeah, I can see it being intimidating. And if you're wondering, even those big circles over in the upper left and the lower left, those would basically be step sequencers. So we can take a look at step sequencers. On Friday, we'll dig into some step sequencers and we'll hook one up and start actually kind of plugging these things in and see what happens with it. But that's essentially kind of what that would be. Those 16 sort of, they kind of make a ring. Basically, those would be each of sort of the time and then the levels basically for each step sequence. But as in the world of Buchla, this could also be a really, really elaborate envelope generator. So as we even sort of talked about ADSRs the other day, this could be basically 16 stages. In every attack, I'm going to have a time, I'm going to have a level. I'm going to go decay, and I'm going to have a time, a level. And then we're essentially just going to have more and more stages, basically all the way up to 16. So, like I said, it could be a step sequencer with variables sort of sliding in between those different times, really advanced envelope generator, and all kinds of other stuff within there. An interesting thing about this thing, it does support MIDI. That MIDI, basically, we can send MIDI messages to this to be able to do a total recall of every single knob on here. So that's pretty cool. And that's Buchla for you, you know. And you might be thinking well, that's great. We can recall the knobs, but clearly all this stuff is going to be patched together, right? So we're going to be able to recall those patch cables physically? Well, sort of, yes. To an extent. Right in the middle, there's sort of this thing called a modulation matrix. You can kind of see like this grid of a whole bunch of LEDs, and there's like some jacks across the top and some jacks across the left. And there's 2 of them. One is basically for audio, and one's for control voltage signals. And basically, as long as we've got all of our sources and destinations, right? Sources, again, being sort of things like LFOs, envelope generators. destinations being things like our VCO, VCA, VCF. We can essentially sort of say, all right, cool, I'm going to have this envelope go to this VCA. I'm going to have this LFO go to this VCF over here. And essentially that can be saved within there too. So as long as your sources and destinations are sort of plugged into that, we can have complete recall of complete sounds on this, not only just the knob settings, but all of the actual configuration, the whole signal flow can all basically be kind of recalled with the touch of a button. So it's pretty cool. Like I said, Buchla, very ahead of his time and a very, very, very smart guy. So, but yeah, like I said, there's the 200E series there. So all support MIDI basically within there. So cool. And here's a company, Modcam. This is actually a current company. Anybody heard of Modcam? Current company making 5U, which is the same size as sort of what we were playing with the other day on my module over there. And let me just take you to their website really quick. I got it up here. So there's Modcam, right? You guys are still seeing my screen here, right? And yeah, let me just click on a couple of these pictures up here, like this here. But yeah, this is what they use to basically make the Tron system. This is Daft Punk, what they used to actually do the Tron soundtrack, basically. So yeah, if you're really into soundtrack of Tron, this is what they used to basically make it, right? And a question for you here, like, what do you think? Even Daft Punk sitting down with this same system, if they made a sound yesterday and then they're going to make a new sound today, what do you think the likelihood that that's going to end up like the sound of yesterday? Even if they were going for the same sound, being like, hey, remember the sound we made last week? Let's try to make that again. You think you're going to get it? Not the same, right? Yeah, a lot of variables within here, slim to none, basically chance of that. And that's kind of the advantage of these things. And that's why a lot of these big people that are in the sound design sort of go with this. A lot of these big sound design people have sort of gotten tired of all the same boring presets. And as you sort of go through the month, you'll probably even recognize some presets and be like, hey, this sounds like the synth on this track that I know. Wow, straight up, just a preset like that. So a lot of times, like I said, these big sound designer people definitely take a level of pride in sort of making these original sounds, and that, you know, when you hear the sound on the record, you're not going to be like, oh, this is preset 201 from the Virus, or, you know, whatever else basically sort of happening within there. So like I said, it's sort of a guarantee that every time they sit down with this, they're going to sort of have a brand new, different, unique sound every single time. And that's a big part of the reason why I've kind of gotten to these modules for that same reason. Just sound design, and I don't want to use the same sound on every song. Every song I want to have different sounds. There's just a whole extra level of sort of originality and creativity that I take pride in putting in my music, is making my own sounds within there too, not just the actual notes that are played in there. So like I said, something like this sort of guarantees that you're going to have unique sounds sort of every time. And yeah, you guys have probably heard of also this guy too, Deadmau5. I'm sure you guys have all heard of Deadmau5. So also has a Modcam system in here. Yep, definitely levels with it for sure. And if you're paying attention, you'll actually see right in the middle of the screen, yep, that is a Buchla with two of those little sequencers that I was talking about, with the whole big rings sequencer / you know, really complex envelope generator type stuff in there. So, but you know, again, Deadmau5, I'm not going to say that there's not a lot of musicality, and I'm not criticizing him by any means. It's just different types of music, right? Just sort of the Buchla thing of like, what's music, man? Music not be dots and lines on a staff and things that we can just sort of notate within pitch and, you know, classical orchestral type instruments within there. Again, it's sort of whatever we make, you know, music, groove, sound. If it's got some kind of, yeah, it's music. And like I said, not to criticize Deadmau5's music by any means. And I will tell you, with working with these systems too, a lot of these are monophonic. You're going to have this huge sound, right, just coming out of maybe one note like your bass. A lot of times if you're using a system like this and this complex of this sound in here, you're not going to have room to throw in some minor and major chords coming out in modular synth. There's just so much sonic space that these things are oftentimes taking up that you're not going to be playing these chords and all these sort of classical music type things within there. And again, with the Deadmau5 music, that's the goal. The goal is the musicality of like, I'm going to play this fancy sevenths and these ninths and all these crazy jazz chords within there. This type of music that he makes is about groove, right? It's about getting people to dance, and it's very much about timbres, right? And hearing these sounds and they're like, whoa, what is that sound, right? Cool. To me, that falls under music, and that's what music is. So, like, different things and different things to different people. But like I said, it's not necessarily about the musicality here, but much more about the groove, the sonics, and like I said, the timbres and just sort of the tones and different things that we're hearing. And it can still be very successful. And again, if you're into that and having those sort of wanting to have those textures, and that's such a big part of your music, you're probably going to take a little bit more extra pride in sort of making your own sounds, making sure that you can sort of go, this is my sound. I made this. I might have spent 4 hours making this sound, but this is my sound, you know? So I don't know, take from that what you will. But again, like I said, it sort of guarantees a sort of original sound sort of every time. And a lot of big sound design people, Richard Devine, BT, like I said, Daft Punk, Deadmau5, all these people have gone through all the years of going through all these apps and using all these plugins and all this kind of stuff. And then they're sort of like, man, I want to make sure I'm going to have original sounds every time. And also a lot of them, like myself, got into this stuff as being musicians. And I don't know, I spend enough time using my computer doing Excel spreadsheets and attendance and all this other stuff that when I make music, I want to turn some knobs, I want to plug some stuff in, not just be using my mouse. So by all means, if you're into that, by all means, you can do that. But like I said, that's a lot of the reasons why a lot of these people are doing that. So, but yeah, there's ModCamp for you. Give you a little bit on that. And as well, probably the biggest as far as the modular sort of realm is this format called Eurorack. They're all 3 rack use high, and I've got some over here. I've actually got some in a suitcase, and we'll take a look at them over the next few days for sure. So the great thing about it too is they can all interconnect. So that's cool too. We can sort of make this thing talk to that thing we were playing the other day, and all have it synced up to the computer, following a drum machine, all that kind of stuff. And it's essentially just sort of not a big sync exercise, but it is sort of getting sync in there, making sure you're getting that tempo information all the way across within there. So, yeah, but definitely very possible to sort of make all this stuff kind of work together. But this modular format here, hugely popular. When I first got into making synthesizers or just playing with synthesizers, I thought I sort of missed the golden age of modular synthesis. We are in it right now. Definitely we're in it right now. This Eurorack format by far is the most popular. There are literally over 100 different manufacturers out there making these kind of modules. So, yeah, if you look at even just how many keyboards available, you might go through 10, 12, maybe get to 20. But here we're talking about literally 100 different manufacturers making these kind of things. And again, too, hopefully you guys think about, do you want to sound like yourself or do you want to sound like somebody else? Right? There's plenty of work. I'm not criticizing if you want to sound like somebody else. There's plenty of commercial work and all kinds of even specific producers I've worked with too that like hear a song on the radio and they're like, we need to make something like this. But also, you might just want to sort of be making your own sound, paving your own way, not following the beaten path, and having an extra sort of level of originality. And this kind of stuff is able to kind of achieve that within there. And within these 100 manufacturers we have in here, understand that's going to be more than the big like Roland, Korg, the Yamahas, all those big companies within there. But also understand when you're looking for something that's going to sound like yourself, right? And you go say like, all right, cool. Oh, there's these new Waves plugins. Well, if I want to sound like everybody else, guess what? Everybody's got the Waves. So you get the Waves plugins, and you got the same timbres and the same tones as everybody else that's got the Wave stuff. But this kind of stuff, like I said, these 100 manufacturers, a lot of these guys are people just maybe making something out of their garage. And just accessibility nowadays, it's easy to be able to manufacture stuff. It's just sole proprietorship. You own this company, you have this stuff manufactured. One person can kind of do it. But understand even like with companies like Roland, right? If one of these guys says, hey, I'm going to take this to Roland, you guys want to manufacture this? There's a good chance they're going to be like, yeah, we don't think that's going to be that popular, and we're probably going to sell a lot of those. There's probably not a market for it, so we're going to pass, right? But hopefully as a creator, producer, musician, you're constantly kind of fighting that. You guys want to sound like everybody else? Cool, get all the most popular stuff. But a lot of times if you're really trying to find your own sound, it's going to be these things that are not popular and the things that the corporate board's going to, no, we're only going to sell 10 of those. We're not going to bother to manufacture that. Well, if there's only 10 of those out on the earth, you guys get that you've got something that's really unique at that point, and there's only 9 other people on the whole earth that have this same module, same plugin, something like that essentially doesn't have to sort of go through that corporate board and be approved. Like I said, that's regularly sort of something you're kind of fighting is like a product successful means that everybody's got it and everybody's going to have those same sounds out there. So having something like this sort of gets you out of that. As well, these being sort of individual modules, we can kind of build our own system. Even if, I showed you all the stuff I had and you're like, cool, I'm going to build one of these. The likelihood you're going to pick all the exact same modules as me, unless you're specifically copying, is pretty much slim to none. You're going to definitely make some different decisions in there. And now you have a completely unique sort of synth. Every time you buy a new module, you're sort of adding to that. And you have something that's much more custom within there. But again, as compared to, say, something like the System 1M, it's sort of we can take all those blocks out there, put them separate there, and swap out a filter for a different kind of filter, swap out a different oscillator for another oscillator. And all these kind of things as individual components, we can really kind of break the signal flow of all these individual modules, right? Like I said, compared to like an integrated sort of all-in-one synth. So take from that what you will, but like I said, if you're trying to find your own sounds, this might be sort of a great way to sort of go across. And I get these things cost money, and they are pretty affordable. Usually maybe a couple $100 a module. So, you buy a module, maybe a few months later you buy another module, a few months later you buy another module, and, you're continuing to build onto your synth, and it gets bigger and bigger. But also there's a virtual sort of representation of this. It's called a VCV Rack. And it actually was a standalone program. I want to say in the last year or two, they've actually added audio unit support. So you can actually open this up inside of Logic, be able to add these little modules and just drag and drop stuff. Most of it's free. There's definitely some modules you can pay for on there. But if you're interested in getting in this and not sure where to start, definitely I would recommend get that piece of software, check it out. Or, even just want to explore some sound design and really what you can do with these. That would be a great way to kind of start, like I said, something you can just kind of start checking out without actually having gear, And if you do want to build one of these systems, also a great way to sort of try things out, right? Get these modules you're looking at buying, build them in a rack in a VCV, see what you can do with them. You might find that you're like, man, I'm missing a key piece of functionality within here as you sort of build this within virtual. So better figure that out before instead of getting all this hardware and, you get a few $100s worth of stuff goes and you're like, man, but I can't control this from MIDI, or I don't have clock, or I don't, have a pitch or something else like that. So a bunch of different ways you could process these. Like I said, you could just get all FX stuff, filters, multi-effects, just run audio tracks through them, create sound, write drums through them, all kinds of different stuff within there. So cool. But yeah, like I said, that's kind of where we're at now with these modular systems. And Eurorack is what it's called, Euro, EURO, and then rack. So, and again, really compact, portable, and relatively affordable as well. So about 1971 here, early 70s, kind of like I said, originally it was Moog and Buchla with these modular systems. And then company ARP kind of came along, started making synthesizers as well. Alan R. Perlman is his name. That's where the name ARP came from, his initials basically. And this is what we have here is the 2600, probably one of the easily the most popular synths of all time, easily top 3 or top 5 within there. And we call it a semi-modular because it sort of follows, hopefully you guys have heard about like normalized patch bass. Maybe an RPR, talk about like, tape return, sort of automatically following signal to the bottom row. This basically follows that same premise. We've got all these patch points on here, right? But point being that everything is sort of normalized. So we've got a mixer. Within that mixer, I'm going to have oscillators 1, 2, and 3. So I've got these patch points. I can patch stuff in there. But if I don't want to patch stuff in, I can essentially just bring up a slider. One slider is going to be oscillator 1. Next slider is going to be oscillator 2. Next slider is oscillator 3. Within the filter, I'm going to have things like envelope depth, LFO depth, all these sort of standard, typical kind of normal sort of parameters, modulation kind of things that you might set up or sort of already set up within here. And all we got to do is bring a slider up. If you want to make more complex patches, cool. Grab some patch cables out there, start cross-patching stuff. You got some other module stuff. All this stuff can all be patched in as well. And be able to mix and match and kind of all kinds of stuff like that. So what understanding modular synthesizer is basically the same as using software like Serum, Massive, or Vital. Absolutely. Because a lot of times we'll see a lot of the same stuff. Like even the stuff we talked about the other day, VCOs, VCS, VCAs, envelopes, LFOs, all those things you'll see on probably 95% of all the synths that you come across. You're going to have those same things within there. So the more you sort of understand that, absolutely. And actually some of the newer things like Serum and Massive, I think a lot of people sort of jumped onto them because they're like, whoa, it's got this like sequencer and it's got this like weird function generator that's not just an LFO or envelope generator. A lot of that stuff has really kind of come out of the modular world. That's very much a Buchla thing, that whole function generator that's even been, I've seen added in Alchemy and these step sequencers and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that stuff, I think just the popularity of modular type synthesis, that a lot of these software manufacturers are like, oh, cool, they got this in modular. They're like, hey, let's put this in this plugin. And now people are like, wow, look at this plugin. It's so different. It's like, yeah, all you had to do is take something new, outside of the sort of 5 circuits we talked about the other day, and adding it in there is definitely going to build to that. So, and I will also add to that. We do have actually back on campus, haven't been at campus in a while, but we have a Macbeth M5 in there. That's a semi-modular, mostly based on the ARP 2600. So kind of fitting well on this slide, no less. And I remember several years ago when I first started messing around with it, I was like, all right, cool, let me start patching stuff in. And I definitely learned some things just by patching things in that I never really would have thought to do on, an integrated or a software instrument. So after sort of just patching some things on the modular, just having that interface, it sort of inspired like, what happens if I take a cable, plug it in here and plug it into there? And I'm like, oh, hey, that was really cool. So a lot of those things that I sort of discovered on that actual modular environment, then I loaded up something as basic like the ES2 that you've got in Logic, and I was like, cool, source this, destination that. Wow, I never would have thought to patch these things in, but putting all these jacks and stuff in front of me sort of said, well, what happens if I patch this cable into here? Oh, I never would have intuitively thought while making my sound I would do that. But again, I definitely sort of discovered some of those things by actually patching some stuff in. So absolutely, it's all kind of the same world within there. And like I said, more and more of these software instruments and software instruments are really incorporating some of that modular functionality that we've got in there. So different things like, different types of formant filters and, like I said, function generators, step sequencers. Most of that stuff all kind of evolves out of the modular world. So definitely absolutely useful. And like I said, something like VCV is free. So by all means, get that, check it out. And it's sort of a little bit more microscopic level. You're looking at individually the filter, everything within that sort of filter. You typically have got a lot more signal flow options as far as control voltage and audio signals within there. So, but yeah, it'd definitely be useful. Even anything you learn in that world to sort of come back to something like even software instruments, you'll intuitively maybe have just a better idea of maybe reasons to sort of patch some things in that you might not think of in just using a software world. So, as is often the case with real instruments, right? So any kind of instrument, oftentimes. So, but yeah, like I said, semi-modular, meaning we've got sort of a normalized signal flow. No problem at all. Like I said, it was kind of fitting that we're on the 2600, and I was like, well, Macbeth liked the 2600. I think that's a great point to even bring across to a lot of people. So yeah, so I'm glad you brought it up. So thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, great question. About the same time, Moog took a different direction and created sort of one of the very first integrated synthesizers here. And integrated meaning that we don't really have a adaptable, open sort of signal flow. In the Mini Moog here, oscillators route into the filters, filter routes into the amplifier. We got envelopes for a filter and amplifier. We got LFOs over on the side. But it's sort of integrated. We don't have individual sort of function generators within here. Everything is sort of just a standard signal flow. And it was sort of the same thing with R2600, where they're like, all right, most people do this. We're going to put these sliders on here, have that normalized signal flow. So same kind of thing here. It's just sort of everything was sort of all routed together. So it was, again, probably what 80 to 90% of most sounds are going to be made with anyway. But again, we couldn't sort of just do some more cross-patching and stuff in here. Everything was sort of a fixed signal flow across the board. Really popular, probably the most popular synth of all time, being the Mini Moog. It is still to this day, if you go to like the NAMM or AES shows and there's some new synth out, they're like, it almost sounds like the Mini Moog filter. This is pretty much kind of the gold standard that most people still compare to this day as far as like synth filters sounding with. And this is what everybody's been chasing for decades and decades. And even in the 70s, a lot of companies like ARP and other companies like that actually got into a lot of lawsuits because of trying to follow and emulate that Moog filter. So of all the things, like I said, Moog, he only patented his filter. That was the one thing he was sort of like, I think I'm onto something. I'm going to patent this. Didn't patent his oscillators, anything else going on in there, but he was sort of knew he was onto something with his filter. And rightfully so. Like I said, everybody sort of tried to copy and chase that sound. And still to this day, most people sort of set that as the gold standard there. So, but there's, of course, been a few reissues of it over the years. But even Behringer's come up with some clones of this kind of stuff. But there's the original one. And like I said, probably the gold standard for most mono synths, sort of within here. Now, fast forward a little bit here. We're at the end of the 70s here. And then there's a company, Sequential Circuits, makes a synth called the Prophet 5. And Sequential Circuits is the company of a guy named Dave Smith. We'll talk about him, I would say next lecture, but just a little bit later today when we dive into the MIDI stuff. Had a big part of having to do with the MIDI and sort of creating this whole MIDI language. So, but before even all the MIDI stuff kind of came about, his company was Sequential Circuits, and he developed this thing called the Prophet 5. Two revolutionary things about this. So this was called the Prophet 5 because it was one of the very first polyphonic synths, meaning you can actually play 5 notes at one time. Yay, you can actually play triads and plays, a root and a fifth sort of in the bottom chord within there. So that's sort of where the number comes from. It was 5 notes of polyphony. And to be clear here, 5 notes of polyphony here means we're going to have a complete independent whole signal flow for each voice. So every single key that we play on here times 5, we're going to have an oscillator, filter, amplifier, envelope generator, and LFO. Want those all to sort of be separate within there. If they're sharing one filter, amplifier, that kind of thing, we get something more of a paraphonic type synth, which is a separate kind of thing here. But fully polyphonic, meaning we've got separate envelopes, LFOs, oscillators, filters, amplifiers, times 5 basically in here for every single note independently within there. So that's what the number sort of indicates. That was one of the very first revolutionary things is polyphony. And the other thing was being able to save our presets. All right. Prior to this, there was no saving presets. If you're doing a live show with something like the Mini Moog, you better know all the settings of each of those knobs in your head, because in between songs, there is no like press a button, go to the next patch. It's literally like, hey, singer, hold on a second. Hey, keep the crowd entertained. Tell them a joke or something. I don't know. Let me get this set up so I've got my sound set up for the next thing. There was no just press a button and you're ready to go, right? You literally had to know all those sounds basically in your head, each of the settings, and literally on the fly in between songs being like, all right, cool. Hopefully that's close. Okay, cool. I'm ready. You know. So this was very revolutionary that finally we could save these sounds on here and just literally be able to now at the touch of a button be like, hey singer, shut up. Nobody likes your jokes anyway. I press a button, next patch, I'm ready to go. Cool, next song. That song is done, cool. Next song, next patch, click button, yay, bam, right? So yeah, kind of like a telephone operator. Like I said, you literally better know all those settings because there was no just push a button. I mean, and it's really not too far off from even guitar players. Kind of that's the thing too. If you got different settings on your pedal, you got to sort of switch down between songs and be changing those settings on your pedal, not just sort of turning things on and off. I know we got foot switches for, but typically most guitar pedals, it's sort of what those settings are, right? You want different settings, you got to reach down and physically turn that pedal. So same kind of deal here, right? So very revolutionary, and both these things were sort of tied together into something by this guy named Doug Curtis that Dave Smith met. And Doug Curtis basically was able to sort of take a whole synth and shrink it basically onto a chip. So he was able to sort of put a whole oscillator on a chip. Prior to this, it was a whole big discrete circuit with transistors and capacitors and resistors and all this room that would basically take up a whole circuit board to be your oscillator. So Doug Curtis basically shrunk this down in a little like op-amp chip. And he said, cool, here's your oscillator. And here's your filter. And so Dave was sort of like, well, what if I put 5 oscillators in here and I put 5 filters and then 5 everything else in here? And oh, cool. Now we got polyphony, right? Now we have 5 complete independent voices we can be able to play. Keyboard players can play chords, right? Not just mono bass lines and lead lines. Be able to play some chords, do a little bit more musicality kind of stuff in there. And like I said, because they're all on a chip and they're being addressed, this is early digital systems within here, but because they're all on a chip, we can essentially be able to save each of the settings. And when you press a button, it basically sends all those values out to the chip and recalls that specific sound, times 5 for each voice. So that's the other thing, really. If we didn't have that sort of within there, back to the mini Moog, even if we had it polyphonic, that means you'd have to sort of change those settings on 5 discrete sort of synthesizers, just be able to do sort of polyphony within there. So kind of all wrapped into one by sort of just putting those synths on a chip. We can essentially address multiple of them at one time to have multiple voices. We can also be able to save, recall, basically be able to have whole settings at the touch of a button to recall. So not moving knobs on that. So we'll point that out. A lot of times, if you recall a patch, we weren't at the point of moving knobs, so the knobs a lot of times will not be necessarily the sound you're hearing. But oftentimes some of these early devices, they have a button that says manual. You press that button, now whatever the knobs are, that's going to be the sound that you hear. As is the case on the next one too, because that same manual button on there. So here's the Roland Juno 106, probably one of the most popular vintage synths out right now. Came out right in 1984, so right about the beginning of MIDI. So it does have MIDI. That's probably one of the reasons why it's still so popular to this day. It's because it's got MIDI and we don't need some extra MIDI to CD operator or some sort of converter sort of happening in between there. But a couple other things about this. 6 notes of polyphony. So like I said, it's polyphonic like the Prophet 5, but times 6, hence the Juno 106. Originally there was the Juno 6, then the Juno 60, then the Juno 106. The 106 is the first one that had MIDI on it, so that's kind of why it's the most popular in there. But 6 notes of polyphony. And as you kind of see, it's pretty basic. It is remarkably basic for as popular of a synth as it is, but it sounds really good. Even just doing basic what it does an extremely well job at that. And it's got a single LFO. And you can kind of see it says DC over there, DCO. And then we say VCF and VCA. So we know VCF is a voltage control filter, VCA is a voltage control amplifier, but what's a DCO? DCO is a digitally controlled oscillator. So the problem with VCOs, voltage controlled oscillators, with a full analog circuit in here, depending on heat, humidity, other environmental factors, your pitch will go up and go down, and it will sort of drift. So you get your keyboard into the club, right? The lights go on the stage, pitch starts going up. Then the AC kicks on the club, then your pitch starts going down, and it sort of like wobbles around, and you're like, man, I can't get this in tune to stay in tune because it's very, like I said, just sensitive to basically environmental sort of conditions. So everybody's sort of aware of this, and what Roland did with this was made a digitally controlled oscillator. So it's got a digital clock inside of there, like a quartz crystal. It's basically dividing everything down within there. And the cool thing about this, since it's digitally controlled, is we turn this thing on, it's in perfect pitch, and it stays in perfect pitch. It doesn't matter if my AC kicks on, the lights light up on the stage, brighten it up, heating up the thing. Because it's digitally controlled, it's always going to be referencing that digital clock within there and always going to be in perfect pitch. It's technically still an analog oscillator, but it's essentially just basically the pitch control is established through the digital system within there. So we get pitch stability here, but again, most people then and still to this day would agree analog filters and amplifiers break up differently, they distort differently, and they sound much, much better than sort of what our digital equivalents do, which is something that, you know, people for the last probably 20 years have been sort of chasing that sound. And yeah, analog, you know, imperfections, they're really hard to recreate within there. And, you know, it's very easy with digital things to be exact, and analog circuits, they're not exact. And that's kind of one of the things that makes them so different all the time. Is it just, you know, there's slight nuances within there that everything is a little bit different every time within that analog circuit. So it's very basic, but it's also, like I said, just straightforward, and it's a great sound. And it's polyphonic, so you can play chords on it, and it's good. It has definitely a very 80s sort of sound to it, but it's a nice warm sound. I'm definitely really a fan of it. So sometimes complex isn't better. Sometimes simple you can just do really well. And the chorus is also a defining kind of characteristic of it. And that chorus really gives us a specific sound to it. And you'll notice the chorus on there is just 2 buttons. That's it. You got chorus 1 or chorus 2. There is no rate and depth. The engineers sort of decided these are the best 2 settings, so this is what you get. I do know of people that have broken these open, modified them, add rates and depth knobs. It seems everybody that's done that is like, man, I should have just left it. These are the best settings, or these 2 that they give you. So now moving in some different synthesis types here. Definitely in the 80s, we started having some advancement of a lot of different types of synthesis. One of these is going to be called FM, right, which is frequency modulation. Same acronym as basically even FM radio stuff happening within there. And basically here, a simple waveform's pitch, we're going to call that the carrier, is modulated by another waveform called the modulator. And really the best, I think, analogy of this is, we talked about vibrato the other day, right? Vibrato, when it's running at sub-audio to give us that wheel. Well, basically, we take that LFO and we kick this up into audio rates, 40 hertz, 100 hertz, 1K, 5K, anything like that, much in the audio rate, we're going to start getting this sort of FM stuff. And we get a lot of things like that are called sidebands. There's a whole lot of math involved with creating all these sidebands, and if anybody really wants to know the math, I can definitely give you an article. I'm generally not afraid of math at all, but when I read the FM math, I'm like, nah, this just doesn't sound like a fun way to make sounds to me. So, like I said, if anybody does want to know that, by all means, I can give you a reference to dig into, but it's not the most intuitive. And really, when this came out, the other thing is all this math, basically, there's a lot of math of ratios between the carrier and the modulator, and when these ratios are set, we get these different types of sounds basically within there. And I'm sure you guys have heard of the DX7 maybe? Maybe heard of the DX7, or at least maybe heard of the Native Instruments, FM7, FM8, right? Or if you've ever listened to any 80s music and you notice a lot of it seems to have this like glass quality, right? It seems like the electric piano is made out of glass and the bass is made out of glass. Like all the instruments sound like they're like very plasticky glass kind of, and you're like, man, yeah, I guess it's kind of a piano, but that doesn't sound like a real piano, right? So when FM came out, big Yamaha was probably the biggest one to do it with the DX7. And, you know, like I said, it's sort of vibrato pit up into the audio rate. But they basically had a handful of scientists and mathematicians that did all this math to basically calculate all these sounds. And this is also what I kind of refer to as the dark age of keyboards, because this is when synthesists and keyboard players stopped making their own sounds. Because, like I said, it wasn't very intuitive. It was a lot of math and science. There was a handful of people that really understood the math and how to make it work. And so most keyboard players would just sort of walk in the music store and they'd be like, hey, yeah, you heard that new song on the radio? You got those DX7 sounds? And they'd be like, here's this floppy disk right here, 1999. I'll have all the new songs on the radio of FM. And everybody's like, cool, I'll take that. Like I said, not very, we didn't see a lot of musicians and the actual keyboard players and synthesists really making their own FM sounds. It was generally just sort of a library, and like I said, all this math basically involved in there. And a big part of why it didn't happen in the 80s, we did have FM on things like you could do that on the Moogs and the Buchlas and all that kind of stuff. But again, going back to our analog oscillators and pitch stability, because of all this math and these ratios that have to be exact to be able to create these sidebands and these timbres, if our pitch goes a little bit out because the air conditioner kicked on, like just happened in my room, or the lights go on the stage, all that math goes out the window. And it doesn't work anymore, right? Because these ratios are all out because everything's kind of drifted out of there. So really FM became much more popular in the 80s because of these digital sort of controlled oscillators in there, and actually digital oscillators. That's going to guarantee we're going to have pitch stability within there. That means we can set these ratios, save them, all these sort of stuff, and all that's going to stay intact because it's all being digitally controlled. So, like I said, FM existed before, but like I said, it wasn't really until the 80s that, again, having these pitch stability, we're going to have the exact same pitch, all these ratios are going to line up, that it really became popular, right? But that was a lot of the sound of the 80s, like I said, all those cheesy sort of glass-type pianos and basses and that kind of stuff. And at the time, people were like, man, it sounds so good. Yeah, I don't think it sounds good. But again, perspective, right? If you've only dealt with Moogs and sequential circuits, and these were the keyboards you had, and along comes the DX7, prior to that, right, something like the DX7, if you wanted to play a piano, you're like, all right, can we bring a whole piano out here? That was kind of the option, right? Or bring a whole organ or a Rhodes or a Wurlitzer or something like that, right? So very kind of revolutionary for the time. So again, give that pitch stability because everything was all digitally controlled within there. So again, in perspective, you listen to those sounds and you're like, man, how did anybody ever think that sounded like a real piano or a real bass or those kind of things? But like I said, perspective, just as sort of people never heard synthesizer sounds before the 60s, right? New sounds, new things, new progressions, new movements, that kind of stuff. So here's a little bit about FM. Another thing that came out in the 80s with digital oscillators is going to be something called wavetable synthesis. And I apologize, this description is a little wordy, but I think the diagram I've got on the next slide will perfectly sort of make this all come into sense. But essentially within this wavetable, right, table of waves essentially, we're going to have a whole bunch of a whole bunch of single cycle waveforms. So single cycle waveforms, just things we were talking about just the other day, right? Things like a sawtooth, that would be a single cycle waveform. We see one cycle of that sawtooth repeating over and over, keeps making that sawtooth, right? Or square, or triangle, sine wave, anything like that. It's just down to a single cycle, we see one cycle of that. But essentially we can modulate this waveform to dynamically, again, just meaning changing over time, the pointer, or oftentimes it's referred to on the wavetable as the index in the table, right? So I apologize if that's wordy, but I think this will make much more sense. All right. So here would be the wavetable. We got a bunch of these single cycle waveforms. Even at the start, we got things like a sawtooth, square, triangle, sine. Maybe these other things are like vocal formant, I, E, O, some of those sort of complex sounds within there. Now that white arrow is basically what we're hearing right now, right? So right now, we play the synth, we're gonna hear that sawtooth wave. And that would be the index. But I could take something like an LFO and modulate that index with it. So instead of it just making the filter get brighter and darker and brighter and darker and brighter and darker, things we kind of talked about the other day, this is now going to sweep across the waves. And that sawtooth is going to morph into a square wave and then turn into a triangle and then a sine and then those other complex waveforms as the LFO is going up, right? And as the LFO starts going down, it basically goes back to the right. Back to the left, right? It goes from these complex things back to the sine, to the triangle, to the square, to the saw. So like I said, if you got an LFO here, it's literally just sort of sweeping across here. And this is very extreme, I'd say much more drastic effect on the sound. Because typically there's things we were looking at the other day. All right, we got this sawtooth. We can change that filter, we can make it brighter, we can make it quieter, we can make it darker, right? We can change the amplitude, but we always got a sawtooth wave. There's nothing really getting around that sawtooth wave, right? That's our source, it's always a sawtooth. It can make it brighter, darker, but we still have the sawtooth. Here we can literally sort of change out what that actual oscillator is. So you could have something just literally morphing between sawtooth, square wave, back to sawtooth, back to square wave, back to sawtooth, back to square wave. Literally in your LFO is just going to move between those two things. So it's going to be a much more obvious changing of the sound because you're not just making it darker and brighter. We're now literally changing out the source where all the sound comes from. We can literally change that out here with these wavetables. So very extreme, like I said, type of settings. Oftentimes used on things like pads, sounds that are going to sort of evolve. So you hit the keys and it's like, right? All these different sort of tones that are sort of going to happen within there. So like I said, a lot of pads, that kind of stuff. The ES2 definitely has some wavetables in there, as does Alchemy, and as does the Virus as far as speaking of hardware that you guys got in the lab room as well. So ES2 has some basic wavetables. The Virus, I think, has 128 different tables. So, yeah, you got 128 tables, and each of those are going to have, I think, like up to, maybe 20, 30 different waveforms within each of them. So, so pretty in-depth, and like I said, if you really want some advanced kind of evolving sort of sounds that don't just get brighter and darker, check out wavetables. Like I said, it's very cool, evolving kind of sound within there. Another synth type we have here, also came out in the 80s, was something called PCM. And this was kind of sort of along the lines of sampling, all right? But we'll talk more about sampling when we get back from the break, week 2, right? But essentially with PCM, stands for pulse code modulation. And they basically take small sound recordings, almost like samples, but really, really small. These are essentially encoded into a ROM, right? ROM standing for read-only memory. And then these act as waveforms with our subtractive synthesis style controls. So this is exactly how the Core Chrome works. Core Chrome is considered a PCM synth. You got all those drum kits in there, right? Those drum kits were not a bunch of triangle waves that magic was done to them to make them sound like a snare drum. Same thing with the strings, same things with the pianos. What they've done is take recordings of those real instruments, burn these onto a ROM. They're encoded, so they're not full like sample libraries. They're much smaller, but they're essentially sort of starting points for us. And if you want to make a string sound, right, you just pull up one of the string things. And you're still going to have, filter cutoff. You're still going to have envelope control and all these other things to start. But you're going to have sort of that string sample as the beginning starting point. It's going to make the whole rest of that process much easier if you're trying to make a real sort of string emulation. And like I said, that's all the drum kits work too. They've taken a sample, a recording of a kick drum and a snare drum and a hi-hat and cymbals and all those kind of things. So we're not literally synthesizing each of those things from scratch using our subtractive style synthesis. They're literally sort of sampling starting points within here. But as far as signal flow, it's all the same stuff we were talking about the other day. Instead of our VCO, we're going to have a PCM DCO, right? It's going to be a digitally controlled oscillator referring to all those different ROM waveforms within there. Then it goes through a DCF, digitally controlled filter. Works exactly like our voltage controlled filter. Then that goes through a DCA, digitally controlled amplifier. Works just like our voltage controlled amplifier. Still got LFOs on the side, still got envelopes on the side. So it's just like our subtractive synthesis stuff, except we've now got these digital PCM samples to sort of replace our standard waveforms, give us much more than sawtooth, square wave, pulse waves and sine waves and triangles. So, and again, DCO, DCF, DCA, if you see those terms, as far as a use, as far as making a sound, they work exactly the same, right? One is digitally controlled, one is voltage controlled. It's really just sort of telling you underneath the hood, it's using a voltage control or it's using digital control. But as far as use as a synthesist making those sounds, if you see you're looking for the VCF and you see you got a DCF, cool. Use it. It's going to be the same. You're going to have your filter cut off. You're going to have resonance, all those same basic parameters within there. It's just underneath the hood. It's actually an analog versus a digital component underneath there. So, but that's the only difference. Like I said, they work the same. It's basically we've got an oscillator, filter, and amplifier. Doesn't matter if it's digital or analog controlled. For the most part, they're going to work the same, at least as far as a user making sound standpoint. And another synth type that came out in the 90s, so we're out of the 80s into the 90s here. And this kind of came out because of sampling. So, and we'll talk about, like I said, we'll get into sampling more week 2 here. But the problem with sampling is we take these sort of static snapshots of an instrument when we're grabbing a sample of, like, say, a sampled, violin or, a real instrument like a saxophone, whatever else we're sort of doing within there, right? And we've really lost a lot of that inherent expression, right? If we take a sample of a sax, we can take a bunch of samples of sax, and maybe we say, hey, play it really soft, play it really loud, and then play it kind of soft, and then moderate, and then moderate. We can take all these different sort of velocities out of there. But inherently within this sample, we've lost a lot of that expression of that real instrument. We've got sort of just these static recordings that we're sort of trying to trigger to emulate playing that instrument. But we've lost a lot of that inherent expression in the instrument, and we're sort of at the liberty of whoever took those samples, however many samples they took. We, like I said, don't have that real instrument to be able to just dig into something or do something like overblow on a horn, something like that. We've really lost a lot of the inherent expression of these instruments. So, what the manufacturer sort of came up with was this idea of physical modeling, where they use advanced computer algorithms to recreate the physical properties of acoustic instruments. What this means, literally, is a sort of, let's take a flute, right? We're looking at a flute. All right, cool. What is a flute as it relates to physics? Like, well, the flute is going to be this metal tube, right? Metal, maybe, depending what kind of flute it is, right? But if that flute is made out of nickel versus made out of silver versus made out of bamboo, all those are going to have very different resonant frequencies within there, right? And it's going to very much affect the change of how that instrument is going to sound, whether it's made out of nickel, silver, or bamboo, right? So essentially they come up with all these sort of algorithms that just recreate each of the components within there. And like I said, within that flute too, we're going to take air pressure, we're going to blow air through this column, right? In physics, what happens if I take this air pressure, blow it through this metal tube, it's going to oscillate, right? Depending what the material of that tube is, it's going to have different resonant frequencies, and it's going to be brighter or darker if it's made out of silver versus bamboo or anything else, glass or anything else like that in there, right? But essentially, it's really just kind of breaking it down to physics. And if we look at something like a bow, right, or something like a violin, different type of impulse. We're not going to blow into this thing so much as now we're going to have this bow that rakes across the strings, right? What's the physics actually as we break this down into physics? What's happening as we vibrate this bow against this other string, right? And then as that string is connected to a wooden body to be a violin, right? If it's made out of nickel or silver or anything else, it's going to sound way different within there, right? But essentially really gives us a lot of the inherent expression that we've lost within these sampler instruments. We're able to sort of recreate through this physical modeling, right? And most of the vintage instruments you guys got in Logic, if anybody's checked out the organ, the electric piano, what's the other one? The organ, electric piano, and the clav. Yep, those are all actual physical modeling. You'll notice if you load up any of those instruments, you won't see anything saying like loading samples, because there's no samples. It's literally recreating all this stuff in real time with these algorithms that like, all right, cool, we're going to press this key. This is what happens when we press the key, makes this mechanical thing happen within there, spinning the wheel on the organ, whatever else basically sort of happening within there. But like I said, it really just kind of breaks down instruments into pure sort of physics algorithms that are just sort of like, what happens if we blow air through here? Also, maybe heard of like the V-drums from Roland. Some of you guys at least maybe heard of those. Some of you maybe. That uses an all physical modeling engine as well. If you get into the V-drums, you don't have all these samples. You're literally able to sort of recreate your drums basically just from parameters that you put in there. You can just be like, all right, cool, I want my snare drum to be 12 inches or 14 inches in diameter? 12 inches. But I want it to be 10 inches tall, right? And then what kind of shell do I want it? Do I want nickel? Do I want silver? Do I want, aluminum? Do I want birch? Do I want maple, right? All these kind of different things within there. And then what kind of heads do I want? Do I want clear heads? Do I want coated heads? Do I want pinstripe heads, right? Changing all those elements within there typically has a very much a change on the effect of the sound that we're hearing within there, right? But that's how the V-drums work. Like I said, they're not samples. We're literally using these algorithms to recreate these things and in space. Like I said, it's literally just almost we put this in space and we say, cool, I'm going to take this drumstick, when it hits the head, it's going to vibrate that head, right? That's the membrane. That's going to resonate the rest of the shell. And this is why we're going to hear this particular sound when we hit a snare drum, right? So like I said, we really get a lot of the expression that we've lost within sampling kind of within this physical modeling thing. So all the vintage instruments are all physical modeling, and also sculpture. If anybody's checked out sculpture, that's probably the, I think, pinnacle of kind of really checking out sculpture. It would be physical modeling, because it's all kind of makes sense in there. I will say, like, back to things like the organ, you can go in there and be like, all right, within this model, we can also tweak these models. So things like the organ, you can be like, do you want this organ to sound like it just came off the line like it was yesterday back in 1962? Or do you want it to sound like it's been sitting in a storage unit for the last 20 years and the capacitor started leaking and get crosstalk and all these other kind of things? We can actually emulate all these things within the modeling to literally be able to recreate what this organ would sound like it's been sitting in a storage unit for 20 years and crosstalk is happening and bleed and all these kind of things within there. So really cool, and like I said, very expressive as far as the instruments go. But things like sculpture here, I'd say it's kind of the pinnacle of it because we can kind of see everything within there, where in the upper left, you'll see impulse, right? How are we going to interact with this thing? Do you want to pick it like a guitar pick? Do you want to bow it like a violin bow? Do you want to strike it like a drum? Or do you want to, what's the other thing? Blow air through a flute within there. Then if anybody's a guitar player, like we got different pickups that pick up and look at different parts of the string, right? Your neck pickup sort of looks at the middle of the string, so it's a warmer tone. Bridge pickup, it's at the edge of the string, right? So we get a much more brighter kind of tone within there. So within sculpture too, we're going to have where we listen to this instrument. And we'll literally see this sort of vibrating line. And you can grab this pickup and put it around where we're going to put basically the microphone that we're listening to the string. In the middle? Is it at the end, right? And like I said, those same kind of guitar things, you'll definitely see sort of translate where we're sort of listening to the string along there. And then in the middle of sculpture, you even got this thing that just says material. And you can go steel, you can do glass, you can do wood, all these different things. You can sort of morph half glass, half wood. What would some sound like if it was half glass and half wood? So essentially, we're able to even allow to recreate these things that might be very expensive and very costly to be able to make a violin that's half made out of glass and half wood, right? But we can sort of do this within this physical modeling and be able to tweak these models and be like, what would a violin sound like if it was made out of glass and half wood, right? So all kinds of cool things like that, and a very advanced kind of type of synthesis. The biggest thing, like I said, we really get a lot of the expression that we've lost within these sample instruments. And we take static sort of samples. So, but that's sort of the signal flow through sculpture specifically. So we got that object, goes through the pickup, then we got a wave shaper, still going to have a filter on there. There's a delay, also physical modeling. There's this big thing called Karpos Strong, and that oftentimes uses a delay and EQ. So that's in there as well to be able to do that. So yeah, all kinds of stuff you can do for sure. And we keep making advancements with synthesis for sure. Now, eventually, this led to something different, and it's sort of a take of this. So as the 90s came about and 2000s, dance music, electronic music, whether even through hip-hop, EDM or whatever, it wasn't really quite EDM back then, but all the trance music and all the different house music and, electronic types of dance music as well as hip-hop, all that kind of stuff. Everybody was out buying all these analog synths. Analog vintage synth market, like, kind of through the roof. Everybody buying all these old, analog synths because everybody kind of came around to like, man, these analog synths had a cool sound. And it's very artificial, but it's cool, and it's different. And like I said, it became really popular at this point. So everybody's buying all these old vintage synths, getting, MIDI to CV converters and dealing with all the problems and maintenance of all these old synths and all this kind of stuff. So eventually manufacturers were like, well, it's great that we're selling all this old gear, but this is stuff we all made profits on 40 years ago. That doesn't really help us as a current company. And not to mention, man, keyboard players probably want some MIDI on this stuff, right? And wouldn't it be cool if you could automate all the knobs and stuff too, which you can't do that on the analog synths. You got to sort of do an audio pass and turn the knob while you're doing a dump like a recording of the track, right? So manufacturers got kind of smart, and they were like, hey, remember that thing we did with physical modeling with physics? Hey, what if we just come up with some algorithms that's going to do what a capacitor does, and what a resistor does, and what a transistor does, and an op amp, and all these individual electrical analog synth components. Then they essentially pulled out all the schematics from the 70s and 80s and recreated them using these models basically within there. And instead of, obviously we're not going to put a matched transistor inside of our computer, but we could essentially sort of create what that matched transistor is going to do through software and using these same sort of algorithms, right? So this is really what most of probably the synth type sounds, if you got Logic, are all using this analog modeling. Obviously, there's no transistors. There's probably some resistors and other things inside of our computer, but there's no analog synth inside of our computer, right? But the way we're able to sort of recreate that sound is using these analog models. And like I said, it's basically the same thing as our physical modeling. We're just recreating each of sort of the schematics down to an electrical level with, this is what happens when I'm voltage through this resistor and through this capacitor and through this transistor and all this kind of stuff. And that's how they essentially built all these kind of the analog synths you got in Logic, ES1, ES2, ESP, ESM, all use this analog modeling technology. And also some of the first ones to do it were probably the Clavia Nord Lead. Roland had things like the Roland SH201. Access Virus had the original Virus A, which then they had the B, the C, then the Indigos, then the TI, and then the TI2. So we're several generations deep in the Virus there. But that's the Virus, and like I said, all the System 1M, also analog model, right? Same thing going on in there. The Moog Mother 32, actual analog, right? Like I said, not using any algorithms, models, anything like that. Moog Mother 32, RIA analog. We can open that up and identify, oh, there's the oscillator. These, 25, probably more than that, 30, 40 components. That's the oscillator. These 40 components make the filter. But here, it's all just sort of done through software, right? And countless software synths have followed. Some of these you might recognize. A lot of them being, emulations of older things like the Jupiter 8, the Korg Monopoly, the Art Kick-Ass. There's the TR-909 drum machine, Yamaha CS80, and newer things out there as well. Definitely utilizing all that stuff too, like Massive and some ones that people even mentioned earlier today as well. But most of the Logic ones, if it sounds like a synth, it's typically using the same analog modeling technology. So pretty cool. And like I said, obviously we don't have an analog synth in our computer, but it's pretty cool. We can sort of make these algorithms that are really going to emulate what that would sound like. So, and they've come pretty close. Definitely come real close. So. All right, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into sampling. Sampling. All right, so basically samples are basically any digital audio recording, any piece of audio, essentially we can trigger through MIDI. So this could be as simple as a drum hit, drum loop, horn stab, guitar stab, vocal, word, phrase, anything like that. Any piece of audio we can essentially be able to map across the keyboard, trigger through MIDI. We'll pretty much define it as a sample. Right? Now, what can we legally sample? The point being that basically all found samples, if you didn't actually record it yourself, typically need to be cleared and licensed. You know, a couple exceptions to that would be things like that are in the public domain. And a huge exception to this would be all that sample library, application content, all the app loops, all the samples, all the stuff with Logic. You guys read your user agreement when you install Logic, right? Yeah, probably not, right? I'm sure you're like, next, agree, next, continue, right? But basically what it says in that user agreement is when you're purchasing Logic, you're essentially granted a license to be able to use all that sample factory content free and clear in your productions. You don't need to thank Apple, don't need to send them any more money or ask them for permission or anything like that. That's just basically part of buying Logic. You're essentially buying a license to all those samples. Now, the one thing that's sort of limited to would be what you can't do would be to take all those samples, put them on a CD or, you know, even a website, whatever else, and be like, hey, here's my sample library. Want to buy it? That would obviously be a problem, right? Then you would sort of be in competition directly with Apple at that point. But like I said, you can free and clearly use those in your productions. Don't need to thank anybody. You don't need to clear the license. Essentially, you're buying a license when you purchase that software. So as long as you purchase that software, any sample content basically included with it, you essentially have a license to be able to use that stuff. All right. But there is no allowable sample time. Some people have the impression or have heard like, oh, I heard as long as it's less than 4 measures, or I heard as long as it's less than 10 seconds. None of those are true. There is no allowable sample time, right? Not to mention measures versus real time, like something like seconds, could be totally different things, right? Depending on our tempo. 4 measures at 20 beats per minute might be a couple minutes. 200 beats per minute might be a fraction of a second. So, like I said, there is no really allowable sample time. If you didn't record yourself, typically you need to clear and license it. That being said, I've not heard of, not to say it's legal, but I've not heard of anybody being sued over a snare hit, over a snare kick hit, any one-shot sort of drum sample from that. Not heard any experience of that happening. But technically, following the law here, if you didn't actually record it yourself, you essentially need to find out who actually did record it and essentially who holds the license for that. All right. So there's no allowable sample time. But like I said, any other libraries, if you bought Contact, any other sampler instruments, anything like that, all those samples included with them, you're basically free and clear to be able to use those. Don't have to thank anybody, cite anybody, anything like that. All right. And the other thing, too, I will just say if anybody heard of music publishing, you guys know about music publishing? Typically, music publishing refers to making instrumental music for like Discovery Show and Discovery Channel and TLC and all these sort of television stuff oftentimes, right? So I will just say if you want to get into that route, not necessarily top 40, you might not have the fame associated with it, but in some ways might be getting your music out to much more people, right? You're not sort of limited to the demographics. People watching Discovery Channel are going to be a much broader demographic than maybe you're pushing to with the top 40 or as an artist. So definitely in a sense of getting your music out there to more people might be a little bit more successful way to do that. But typically, you deal with publishing companies, publishing houses, it's sort of the in-between. And you basically send all your music to them, and they sort of deal directly with these cable networks and television networks and all that kind of stuff. But typically the problem with that is if you have anything with samples in there, there's sort of layers of copyright, all right? Typically when Discovery Show has a new, or Discovery Channel has a new show that they're going to put out, they're essentially going to copyright that whole episode, right? Or that whole series, season of episodes, etc. And then Umbrella essentially is going to include everything else in there. If you got some James Brown sample that you put in there that you slip within there, somebody's going to spot that. They're going to come after Discovery Channel, right? Because they own the copyright, all the layers and the umbrella of all that kind of stuff. And what that basically means is bad news that you'll probably never be doing music publishing stuff ever again. It's a good way to sort of get blacklisted from that and be able to do it ever again. So, like I said, if you're going to do music publishing stuff, just make sure you're not using any samples within there. Like I said, it's just sort of the layers of the copyright involved in that they're essentially just going to license that piece of music. Their copyright essentially is going to include everything in there. So, kind of make sense? Anybody have any questions on that as far as the legalities of all that kind of stuff? I'm not a lawyer, but, make sure, just make your own stuff or make sure you got licenses for your samples, right? And a lot of times, too, people think it's all about deep pockets. And, it is. Nobody's going to really sue you unless you got the money to be able to pay, right? But you never know when you might hit it. And understand that when you do make it, if you do make it, people are going to go through all your back catalog, and that's where they're going to start searching for all that kind of stuff. As your new audience members might be too, right? Let's go through the back catalog, see what this person's been doing all these years that I've never heard of this person. But again, these same sample police sort of people are going to be going through the same stuff. And now that you got that hit, even though that isn't the hit, they're going to go, hey, remember that song 5 years ago you used that unauthorized sample on? Here comes the lawyers, right? So like I said, you want to set yourself up for that and be like, I don't have any money. Nobody's going to sue me. Hopefully you don't want to keep yourself from being in that situation, right? Otherwise, you do, and then use it, and then you get sued, and then you're not making any money, and you're not able to sort of get out of this anyway, all right? And there's all kinds of legality issues. Best thing, get a contract, find basically who owns the copyright, the publishing basically on it, and essentially contact them and have a contract as clear as possible, right? The more ironclad you make that contract, the better. Put in there, you're going to use this many seconds of the sample. You're going to use it 32 times within the song. All that kind of stuff basically within there. You want to put as detailed and ironclad as possible. This is what we're going to use. This is how much of it we're going to use. We're going to use it this many times throughout the song. All that kind of stuff. This is America, and nobody can stop anybody from suing. People can just choose to sue, and, it goes to court. But hopefully if you've got a contract in there that's ironclad, that judge, as soon as you get to the court, the judge is going to go, what's the problem here? You agreed to do this. Everybody agreed. You were going to use this much of the sample this many times. Why are we here? And hopefully the case is thrown out at that point. But again, courts always cost money, and lawyers and all that kind of stuff, and probably money that would be better spent put in our pockets instead of paying lawyers to fight all this kind of stuff within there. So, all right. So, cool. Probably Library Congress. Also, a lot of times if you just check like the liner notes on stuff, I know a lot of times things are not printed so much nowadays. But typically, I know on even Spotify, you can go in and view credits and actually look at all the credits, basically the publishing, all that kind of stuff, basically who holds the copyright. So you basically reach out to that person. Cool. All right. So, So that being said, let's talk about how to do it. All right. So our samplers, we're going to break these down into two subtypes, sort of like we did with our sequencers the other day, a week ago, right? Basically being dedicated, non-dedicated hardware and software devices. All right, so our hardware devices, just like our sequencers, designed to do a specific function, does it extremely well, and it's a closed system. Doesn't need to check these internet caches, all these other things sort of building up within there. Designed to do a very specific function, does it extremely well and extremely stably. And again, like I said, closed system, there's not going to be constant updates for this and all these other things sort of happening in there, as our computers are sort of a generic platform that does all kinds of different stuff. Typically, a hardware sampler is just going to sample, right? That's it. So it's going to be extremely stable with that. Disadvantages. Typically lower memory amount. So just understand the development cycle of these hardware samplers sometimes is a little ways out. So Kai might say, hey, let's make a new sampler. And if they start this today, we might not actually see that sampler for a year, right? They're essentially going to have relatively small development teams, maybe 10 or 20 people working on the hardware, 10 or 20 people, if that, working on the software. Essentially, like I said, small teams, they might take sort of a year to actually totally see that product come to light. But again, in that time, they're going to sort of make decisions now. What's the fastest RAM we got available now? Cool. All right, this is what we're going to put in there. A year from now, that's not going to be the fastest RAM available, right? As we've seen within computers, riding that bleeding edge of technology, we got new types of RAM, faster types of RAM coming out with computers at least once a year, sometimes even more than once a year within there. So typically the memory, the RAM, is going to be where our samples live. And the lower RAM we have here, the less samples we're going to be able to basically be stored in the sample device. All right, so that kind of works against us there as well. Like I said, just sort of a longer development cycle. And number one thing for our hardware, at least for my purposes here, would be separate media for storing our samples. So if we use a hardware sampler, we're going to store all these samples on the RAM and that piece of hardware, right? And then eventually we got to save these things, right? And oftentimes, at least in my experience in the old days, it was all saving things on things like these floppy disks, right? Anybody know how much space is on this floppy disk? This is a 3.5 inch high density, double-sided, double density disk within here. And awesome. Wow, that's so rare that many people even get those numbers right. People are like, I don't know, 2 gigs, 5 gigs, 350 megabytes. But 1.44 megs. That's exactly right, Devin. And George, you had the right numbers in there. Yep, so pretty close in there. And I will tell you, this physical format from growing up in these, I remember them being half of that. So 720 kilobytes, that was just a double-sided, not double density. And then the original ones were even half of that. So literally 360 kilobytes roughly. So yeah, not a lot of space on these. And even at the 1.4 megs, anybody know how much space rough rule of audio kind of takes up? Let's say CD quality, 16-bit 44.1. I wouldn't really expect you to know this, but it's generally about 5 megs a minute mono. All right, so CD quality audio, we're looking at 5 megs a minute mono, and this floppy disk holds 1.4 megabytes. And even if we're dealing with one of these older samplers that has a whopping 32 megs of RAM, right, compared to our computers, you're like, wait, did you just say megabytes? Yep, I said megabytes. And then, again, we got to store all these samples on these floppy disks. So you're looking at probably 20, 25 different floppy disks just to be able to save maybe those 32 megs of RAM. Not very efficient, right? And what the biggest thing that I see is what do we do with these things, right? We're going to have piles of these things. If I'm working even 32 megs of RAM per song happening in there, that pile is going to sure add up, right? As I'm going through maybe 2 boxes of floppies every song that I'm working on. If I'm working on even, a song a week, after 6 months, we're going to need a new room just to be able to put all of our floppies in there, right? And also, probably biggest thing in here, God forbid something like a fire, hurricane, something like that happens in your studio, all these floppies melt, get waterlogged wherever else. There's nothing really we can do to get all those samples back, right? Somebody calls us in 5 years and they're like, hey, you remember that remix you did back in 2018? And you're like, you remember that hurricane that happened in 2022? And they're like, oh, you lost everything, huh? Yeah, I lost all my samples, everything. So that kind of stinks, right? So that's why I definitely put this as a huge disadvantage. And also from growing up in these things, the time it would take to just do these things. We used to have this thing called the floppy disk shuffle where you're like, all right, cool, done with the song. Now I got to save all these samples. Get my boxes of floppies ready to go, right? You put the disc in. It's like, it goes for 20, 30 seconds, right? And then it's like, please insert next disc. Right, so we could spend easily several minutes just basically shuffling discs every, 30, 45 seconds to put those all in there. And also, if we want to recall that stuff, we're like, they want a different mix. Let's load everything back up. Now you get to sit and load up those boxes and boxes of floppies within there. So, like I said, we used to have a name for it called the floppy disk shuffle. That was literally just flopping discs all the time, right? So, and I can't even tell you, I remember seeing a group back in the 90s, industrial group. I used to play a lot of shows with Marilyn Manson when they were a local group back in South Florida. And one of these guys, industrial group, I swear this guy was just changing discs more than he was like playing. He'd be loading up sound effects. Like I said, it was kind of an industrial group. And you'd hear him like play like a laugh. He'd be like, wah, wah. And then he'd be back over loading discs up, loading discs up, loading discs up. Bang! And loading up this, loading up this, loading up this for sound effect. So not very efficient easily within there with all that separate media happening within there. And like I said, it's limited as far as the space within there and where are we going to put all these kind of things. So on the software side, higher memory amount, right? More RAM available. We got new types of RAM coming out at least every year, sometimes more than once a year. Computers definitely live on that bleeding edge of technology. As soon as there's a new type of RAM out, we're going to see that in the new Apple computers and the new, computers basically all coming out in there. Our computers literally kind of inspire and live on that bleeding edge of technology where we're going to see all that stuff immediately right there. So definitely following much more current and higher memory amounts, newer OSs to deal with higher amounts of RAM, all that kind of stuff that we're easily up into the several gigabytes of RAM typically on our computers, right? And this is number one for me, is the samples are saved and recalled with the session, all right? So let's just take a step back here and just take a look at our hierarchy of sort of our session, like in our project folder within there, right? Typically, we're going to have a project folder. Inside that folder, we're going to have the actual project file, right? The project file will contain things like the MIDI, your track names, tempo, all that kind of stuff. But the audio files aren't in there, right? And really what that project file does is it sort of just references and it says, hey, there's this region called Audio 1. Hopefully it's not called Audio 1, right? But Audio 1 that starts at measure 5 on track 1. There's another region that you did name called Bass 1 that starts at measure 2 on track 2, right? But essentially, it's just going to have basically referencing this audio file goes here. But it's not actually in that project file. Then next to that project file, we typically have a subfolder in there that says audio files. And that's actually where all of our audio files go. And when we load up that project essentially is just referencing these audio files. And when it says, hey, play audio 1 here, looks at that audio files folder, starts playing audio 1. Oh, bass 2 starts playing here. Cool, looks at that folder, starts playing that. All right, everybody hopefully is good with that sort of structure hierarchy that we have going on, right? But the project file by itself typically doesn't have all the audio files, right? Just basically references where these audio files are. So samples. Samples are audio files. wouldn't it almost just make more sense in that same hierarchy to put another subfolder next to that audio files that just says samples? And let's put all our samples in there. And any software instruments I have just going to reference that folder. Yeah, right. And then as far as backup and like where are we going to put all these floppies? Best thing is we take this whole project folder that contains a project file, contains the audio files, contains all the samples, and I put those on OneDrive, or I put them on my Google Drive, or I put them on, Dropbox, whatever offsite sort of cloud backup solution you have. That way, even if that server literally falls in the ocean, typically all these servers are copied multiple places all around the world. So, like I said, even God forbid a hurricane, fire, something like that happens to your studio, of course, you still need all the gear, right? And hopefully insurance is going to get you that, right? But nothing's really going to get back the stuff, right? Doesn't matter how much money you can get from insurance, it's not going to pay for all the stuff that you've lost. But again, if you're backing all these things up to cloud-based services, right, you've got all this stuff, and it's just a matter of getting the gear back in there. Once you got the gear, all your work can still be recalled within there. All your samples saved on the cloud, all next to your audio files. And like I said, it's also just when we load up that session, somebody says 5 years from now, hey, why don't you do a freshened up remix of this track you did 5 years ago? You're like, all right, cool. Let me just find this off my Google Drive, or, Dropbox, whatever else, load that up. Oh, look, it knows where all the audio files are. Oh, look, it just loaded up all the samples too. Yay, right? I'm not spending all this time looking for discs, loading discs, all that kind of stuff. Sort of all just goes together. So as much as I obviously like using hardware, right, I don't use any hardware samplers. If I'm going to use a sampler for these reasons alone, really, just for me, it makes much more sense to do it in software. And again, samples are just audio files. Well, I got audio files already on my computer. I might as well just keep them all together there, right? Keep them in one nice, neat place. That way I back up that project folder and everything's backed up. I'm not like, I got to back up these samples and these discs that load up with this project and this and that and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely think software samplers definitely win in this situation here, right? And the only disadvantage we're going to have in our software, lower stability. Again, we got this computer that's not really designed for necessarily music making. Somebody essentially writes software to manipulate it to make it do what we want to do. And not to mention all the other stuff we also depend on this computer to do is definitely going to contribute to that lack of stability, right? So, and again, if I haven't said this before, make sure you're quitting other programs. If you're working in Logic or Pro Tools, whatever music making app you're using, audio app, quit everything else, right? Really all you want running when you're running Logic is you hit Command Tab, you should see Logic and the Finder. That's it. If you're running Pro Tools, you should see Pro Tools and the Finder. That's it. If you need to run some other third-party thing, great. But like in general applications, make sure you don't have Excel running. Make sure you have Spotify quit. Believe it or not, you think Spotify runs on our phones, easy enough. But I've actually noticed Spotify seems to use up quite a bit of processing power on my computer. So it is very important, I think, to just make sure to quit Spotify even before you load up Logic. So obviously, if you need to, transcribe something, you might have some reason to do that. But general, make sure you're hitting Command Tab and you got nothing but your DAW sequencer, and the Finder should be running. That's it. That'll definitely contribute to better stability within there. All right, cool. All right, so samples are obviously digital audio, right? And we got to talk about some digital audio here, and digital audio as well, not going anywhere. We're definitely dealing with digital audio. I don't think we're going back to tape. We're probably definitely not going back to cutting records live within here. So the wave of the future of all recording essentially is in digital audio. And not just recording, I would say most people, even in ShowPro, most live events are all running digital boards now. There's still some analog boards, but most groups are going out with digital boards, with digital console recall and all that kind of stuff, meaning everything is passing through that digital board. So you'd still be dealing with this digital audio, even in the live arena, as well as in recording. All right. So digital audio basics here. So first thing, to digitize this, right, you guys probably talked about an RPR transducers. Right, transducers sort of take air pressure, changes in our air pressure, right, turn them into a voltage, right? So this analog to digital converter, or A to D converter, is just going to sort of build on that, right? It's going to take this analog voltage, as our transducers make, right, and essentially convert this into digital bits of ones and zeros, things that our computer's actually going to be able to store, right? We can't just store random voltage values within our computer. We sort of got to convert this into something that the computer can store and recall. Right, so that's what this A to D or analog to digital converter is going to do. And again, air pressure, right? Changes in air pressure. That's what sound is, right? Goes through that transducer to turn them, typically most often being a microphone here, to turn that into a voltage, right? So now we're just going to take this voltage, run it through this analog to digital converter or A to D converter, and that's essentially going to turn it into digital bits, ones and zeros, things where computers can all store to its hard drives, store to its RAM, all that kind of good stuff within there. And also understand on playback, we have the exact opposite coming out here, right? Our computer is basically spitting out digital bits, ones and zeros. That's then going to go through a D to A converter, staying for digital to analog converter. That turns it back into a voltage. And then that voltage is then going to go through our speakers, another transducer, to essentially so we can actually hear that voltage, right? Because again, for us to be able to hear that voltage, we got to turn it back into air pressure. So like I said, it's a two-way street here. As we deal with these computers, essentially we got to take the air pressure, turn it into a microphone to a voltage goes through an A to D converter, turn it into digital bits. And then on playback, we're going to have those digital bits come out of our computer, those go through the D to A converter, turn it back into a voltage goes into our speakers turn that voltage basically back into air pressure, and we can actually hear it. Yay! Right? But that's sort of our path to get all this stuff inside and out of the computer, basically. Like I said, these digital bits are kind of useless without speakers, right, and a D to A converter, because we got to hear what's going on in here. Okay? All right, so two specifications of digital audio. All right, two defining things, and even when I mentioned CD quality before, I sort of mentioned them. Anybody remember what the sort of two specifications, ways that we've sort of described digital audio? One has to do with sort of our amplitude, and one has to do with how high of frequencies we can record. Anybody know what I'm talking about here? Anybody heard of bits? Bit depth? Yep, cool, awesome. So even I mentioned before, CD quality is 16 bits, right? So that refers to the bit depth on there, right? And bit depth is going to determine our dynamic range as well as our signal to noise ratio, right? Those are inherently sort of related together. And each bit essentially gives us 6 dB of dynamic range. So CD quality, right? 16 bit, 16 times 6 gives us 96 dB, right? So that's essentially the dynamic range of a CD from the loudest to the quietest signal, essentially is 96 dB. And then also basically puts our noise floor, right, signal noise ratio at 96 dB down, right? Because that's essentially anything quieter than that minus 96, essentially is going to we're not really going to be able to capture within there, right? So dynamic range, signal noise ratio, and really I'd say sort of the height of the waveform, right? Like I said, each bit essentially gives us 6 dB of dynamic range. So if you've heard of 24-bit recording, right? 24-bit recording, 24 times 6 gives us 144. So we have 144 dB of dynamic range on something like 24-bit. Right? All right, and the other thing we have here, bit depth, and then what's the other thing that's going to be our sort of specification? If we're ever talking about digital audio, we're going to say it's got this many bits, and the what is bits, and it's really going to be the speed, and it's going to determine the highest frequency you can record here, and that's going to be called the sample rate. Right? This determines the highest frequency we can actually record. The sample rate always needs to be double the highest frequency we want to record. Right? Point being, so 44.1 sample rate, right? 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate means we can record half of that. 22.05 kilohertz is going to be the highest frequency we can record. Right? And this sample rate is literally just the rate, right? The speed with how quick we're basically looking at analyzing, looking and sampling essentially what this audio voltage is going to be at this given time, right? And reason it needs to be double, let's just go to my whiteboard here. All right. So the sample rate is almost like these lines, right? It's how quick it's basically sampling the audio right across here at the bottom. So here's our waveform in here, and let's say we got a big waveform in here like this, right? And as this is all captured, basically as it goes through the sample rate, it's looking at our height of our waveform with the bit depth in here, and it's essentially going to sort of put a dot there, and it puts a dot here, and it puts a dot here, right? Based on the sample rate within here, it's essentially going to put all these different dots basically where each of these sort of sample rate moments comes through, right? And really our computer isn't recording these round lines. Right, it literally is sort of going, okay, cool, this goes here, then this is going to go here, here, and it's sort of straight lines within there. And then typically you've got sort of your D to A converter typically sort of smooths this stuff out to sort of try to round them off as much as possible, right? But essentially, like I said, it's just sort of the rate that we're looking at and where we're going to analyze, and we're able to sort of trace these waveforms as we record them, all right? Now, why it needs to be double. So let's say I got something really high, like a really high frequency in here, right? Actually, let's go higher than that. Let's say it was in here, all right? Again, based on these sample rates, it's going to put a dot here, then it puts a dot here, then it puts a dot here, it puts a dot here, right? It puts a dot here. you guys realize that we weren't able to really trace this in here at all because the sample rate is outside of that, right? So really why this needs to be double is because we need a point to tell it that there's a peak up at the top, and then we need a point to tell it that there's a trough sort of underneath here, right? So that sample rate has got to be double this frequency, because to be able to make this particular sine wave, that particular frequency, we need 2 points within there. If we're only sampling, half that time, we're not going to see this frequency. It's going to see the high, it's going to miss the next one, and then we're down over here, and we've totally missed that frequency happening in there, all right? So this needs to be double, right, of whatever the highest frequency we want to record, so we can actually sort of make the point, the crest and the trough, basically, of the wave within there, right? But like I said, we have a sample rate that's fast enough to be able to get this point, as well as this point down here. One isn't going to be enough in there, so that's why it always needs to be double. Right? So if you've heard of like 88.2 sampling rate, means we can record up to 44.1 kilohertz. 96 kilohertz sampling rate means we can record up to 48 kilohertz, right? 192 sampling rate means we can record up to 96 kilohertz within there, right? And some of you guys were probably told, right, and, that we only hear up to 20 kilohertz, so, right? Well, there's been a lot of debate about that. I'd say the last maybe 10 or 20 years within there. The early days of digital audio, they were like, all right, cool, we can hear sine waves up to 20 kilohertz, so cool, we'll just set the sampling rate a little bit above that 20 kilohertz, 44.1, cool, that means we can record up to 22.05, cool, we got some extra in there. And then they sort of discovered that we're actually missing some things within there. And it's, of course, source dependent, but things like violins are very high frequencies, right? Even just the fundamentals are very high frequencies. Of course, we're going to have harmonics that definitely go above there. So there are a lot of orchestral instruments, very high frequency instruments that definitely do have harmonics and do have content up into that 30 kilohertz, 40 kilohertz, that kind of stuff within there, as these harmonics are in there. So like I said, it's of course source dependent on what you're actually recording within there. But a lot of times things like classical music are great examples of that, because we have these really high frequency instruments with these high harmonics that definitely go above that 20 kilohertz in there. And also typically classical music is very dynamic as well, right? We have loud sounds, we have quiet sounds within there. And that's where we're really going to appreciate that extended dynamic range, higher signal-to-noise ratio happening within there as you're watching a movie, right? And things start getting quiet. It sort of sucks you in, you're like, what's going on? And then the car comes crashing in, right? That's what you sort of want within there. If we don't have dynamic range, everything is all just kind of the same level within there, right? And we're not necessarily going to have a need for a higher bit depth within there. If everything is all just pumping up at the top within there, we're not going to essentially appreciate all the sort of subtleties of when things get quiet, right? At a lower bit depth, we'd start hearing that noise floor coming in. We're like, what's going on in here? Man, I need to turn it up. And then you hear all that noise floor sort of moves up in there. So again, by having higher bit depth in here, we're able to keep that noise floor much lower, and we can get to these quiet passages, and it's still going to essentially be silent within there. All right. Cool, makes sense. Here's another way to look at these, right? There'd be sort of our waveform in there. And again, the bit depth really determines the height of our waveform. It's our dynamic range, right? It's the signal-noise ratio, dynamic range, how far we can essentially stray from zero within here. Amplitude, right? And then our sample rate, just how quickly we're basically looking at this audio. And audio doesn't happen without time, right? So that's essentially why we have this sample rate in here. And it always needs to be double the highest frequency we want to record, right? Any questions on that? I will also add here on the bit depth especially. When a lot of you guys I imagine a lot of you guys are going to be in recording arts, and at some point you'll be recording some bands in there, and then you're going to be recording at 24-bit. And a lot of times, like I say, generally you record things as hot as possible, but if you're using something like 24-bit, lab specialists are probably going to tell you, or your instructors are going to tell you, like, hey, you don't need to ride that waveform up to zero. We're running at 24-bit here. So you can shoot for like -12, -14, somewhere around there. That gives us extra headroom. But at 24-bit, we're essentially not going to be hearing that noise floor down there, right? So essentially it gives us more headroom there. If the musician, vocalist, whatever gets a little louder, we're not going to peak out at that point. We have that much more extra headroom within there, right? The other thing, too, even though you might be working on like a band project that essentially is going to be going down to 16-bit at the end, why would you record at 24-bit? If our CD at the end here is going to be 16-bit or even less quality is going out to things like Spotify, SoundCloud, all these streaming services, it's not even going to be sort of CD quality within there, right? So why would you do that, right? Why would you do that is, so think about this. If we're recording a band, and let's say we're using 16 bits across here, right? So 90-6 dB is our dynamic range. And we record 24 tracks in here, right? So our noise floor that's 96 dB down, what's going to happen as I start adding 24 tracks with that 96 dB down noise floor? is that going to bring our noise floor up? Because we're now stacking 96 dB noise across 24 tracks. Yeah, here comes that noise floor all creeping up in there. You're like, man, what happened? We didn't hear that when we were recording. But as we start summing these tracks together, right, every time we're adding the same signal together, it's increasing the amplitude within there. And absolutely, that's going to so much kill your dynamic range of 96 dB, because now everything, as all those things get stacked up, it's all going to start adding up and start bleeding into that stuff. So typically, it's pretty often that most people will record at 24-bit, even if you're going to mix down to 16-bit. That way we have all that extended headroom, but we also have that noise floor that's 144 dB down. Now when we start tracking 24 tracks together, it's still going to increase that amplitude, but that amplitude is still going to be way, way down, probably below where we even hear it on a CD. All right, so like I said, it's pretty common that a lot of times you will record at a higher bit depth, even though you might be sort of mixing, mastering down to 16-bit. That's sort of why, essentially, because that extended headroom, but also probably most importantly is that noise floor. And again, when we're going to sum all these tracks together, that's going to essentially start bringing up that noise floor if it's the same spot down there. So typically it's pretty common that you'll record at a higher bit depth, even if you use 44.1, just sort of a CD sample rate within there. Sample rates, in my experience, just over the years of doing this was always a very time-consuming process to do something like sample rate conversion. So I could tell you, I used to have, sometimes we'd work on a session, we were like, we did this one at 48, now we got to convert it down to 44. And this was like a typically like, all right, start the sample rate conversion and come back in a few hours and maybe it'll be done. So, but especially something like 48 to 44.1, there's not easy math to make that work. So we're just going to have to sort of drop random pieces of information to sort of convert that 48 into something like 44.1. So if you do have to do a conversion, I think something like an 88.2 at least is going to be half that we can sort of dump down to 44.1. But just be aware of that math sort of within there, that sometimes the sample rate, I've probably more stuck with that is, what is the target on here? Cool, we're doing 44.1. Cool, let's just start with this 44.1, leave it at 44.1. Even though you might oftentimes record with a higher bit depth. So keep that in mind. Higher bit depth, pretty common out there, but sample rates may be changing a little less, depending on, of course, what you're recording. So that's the other thing. If we're using something like an MPC to make all of our tracks, everything out of there is coming out 16-bit, 44.1. So maybe you won't have a reason to use sort of a higher bit depth or sample rate if it's all coming out of synths that are all, DDA converters on your Core Chrome as a 20-bit or that kind of stuff within there. So it's all sort of source dependent. And like I said, where you could really probably most appreciate these things would be in classical music, just because it has a lot of dynamic range. So we hear these quiet passages. You can not hear that noise floor sort of peak up, start coming into the audible range, but also the harmonic content. Typically, we have much more harmonics in the above, 20 kilohertz kind of stuff happening in there. And like I said, there's definitely math that says that we at least sense those frequencies. Even though we might not hear sine waves at 30 kilohertz, we're able to sort of sense them, and they also affect the waves that we're hearing underneath there. So it does affect the waves, and it does affect sort of the sound that we're actually hearing within there. So, but like I said, all dependent on what you're recording. So, all right, cool. Any questions on that? Probably give you hopefully a good intro to just digital audio stuff. And like I said, digital audio is not going anywhere. This will be regardless of what field you're going to go into the audio industry, you're almost guaranteed to be dealing with this digital audio stuff. So, and I'm sure some of your other classes will get deeper into this and talk about quantization there and go through the whole A to D converters and that kind of stuff, all the individual components of it. But hopefully just get everyone on the same page and just start thinking about what these two things are going to do by changing them, right? So, all right, cool. All right, so on our hardware devices, remember they've got RAM, and that's typically where all these samples need to live, right? So the samples are typically recorded or loaded into RAM. And we want these in RAM, not on the hard drive, right? Because the RAM is essentially going to allow fast, relatively instant access. So I'm sure you guys have probably like quick view to file on your desktop or somewhere on your computer, right? Where you get some audio file, you hit the space bar, fan go, and it's like, all right, hold on. All right, cool, and then it plays. That's not going to work if we're trying to play a drum loop, right? Or just play drum hits, samples of, a kick and a snare drum that I'm trying to play in. I can't hit the kick and then wait 2 seconds and then it plays. That's not going to work for what we're trying to do this whole month of this sort of sequencing stuff in there, right? So because of that, we want our samples to be in that RAM, so we're going to have relatively fast, relatively instant access to them, right? And a big thing allows us to musically rhythmic sequencing of these samples. Again, all this quantization stuff is all kind of useless and PPQN stuff if we were dealing with a 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds of sort of latency before I hit my key and hear the sample, right? So typically all these samples live in RAM for that fast, instant access that as soon as you hit the key, we're going to essentially hear it play immediately. And our hard drives typically have just slower access times. Takes more time to essentially find things on that hard drive. It's got to spin around, find what it's looking for, and be able to play it. So it takes a little bit more time. So typically your samples are just going to go into direct RAM. That way, as soon as you hit that key, you're going to hear the sample playing. You can play drum beats. You can trigger loops on time, all that kind of stuff basically within there. Now, also on our hardware, storage options. Of course, floppy disks. That would be the old school original way to do it, probably easily the most common. I remember quite a few of those old samplers at some point having hard drive options. Things like ID drives you could actually put inside of the sampler. They did have space inside of there. But even more so than that, what we'd see on most of all the old samplers were all these things called SCSI ports. Anybody heard of SCSI before? SCSI stands for Small Computer Systems Interface. Of course, you've heard of it, Devin. Not surprised. But yeah, that was sort of the high-speed bus we had prior to FireWire. All right, all the Macs used to have SCSI ports on them before FireWire sort of came out, and all the hardware samplers had SCSI ports on them. So you could easily sort of buy a SCSI hard drives, buy SCSI CD-ROMs. You could hook your computer up with a SCSI port, all kinds of kind of things like that to do as well. So floppy disks, most inefficient. Like I said, you have boxes of floppies for a track you're working on. A hard disk, you could at least put a few tracks on there. I say a few because now I get hard drives can be gigabytes, but I remember a sampler, a drive I had hooked up to my sampler was, 40 megabytes. Well, this is like 35 floppies, so that's a lot of space, right? So yeah, it's all relative what a lot of space is within there. But hard drive options, of course, there was options for that, SCSI drives as well as internal mounted drives. We have something called SDS, standing for Sample Dump Standard, and this basically sends your samples to the MIDI cable. Wait. MIDI's not designed for audio to go through the cables. That is correct. But we can send these samples as digital bits basically through the MIDI cable. Very, very, very slow. It's been a long time since I've done this, but years ago I did this where I was like, all right, I got these couple samples. I load it up on my sampler. Let me throw them over the computer so I can sort of top and tail, truncate, edit, visually be able to see on my computer screen instead of dealing with all the numbers and the tiny text on my sampler, right? So I was like, cool, let's do this SDS thing. I might have had 3 loops, maybe 4 or 5 seconds a piece. So maybe we're talking about 15 seconds worth of time. I said go. Probably took 15, 20 minutes just to get those samples basically over to my computer. So 15 seconds took probably 15, 20 minutes. So not fast by any means, not in real time by any means. But the advantage of this is it keeps us digital bits. So what we have on our computer using this SDS is going to be an exact copy. All right. Would it be faster to go analog out on the sampler, hook up some analog cables, go to analog in on our computer? Yes. But every time we go through a set of those conversions, we're basically chopping off 6 dB dynamic range. Not to mention any noise introduced by cables, anything else like that in there as well. But like I said, every time we go through a set of converters, we're basically chopping off 6 dB dynamic range within there. So that's definitely going to degrade our signal going that way. So doing something like SDS here is really slow, but it keeps an exact copy. Like I said, all the bits, exactly what we recorded, is maintained as those digital bits, essentially is moved over the computer. We can do our editing, send it back, not losing any bits, not losing any dynamic range, not losing any quality of that. We're keeping all those digital bits, and what we have as an exact copy is able to essentially be moved around with our computer and these samplers that way. Right? So probably the most efficient way to do it would be if you got digital outs on your computer, or digital in on your computer and outs, and you got digital in and outs on the sampler. That would be the way you could sort of do it in real time without that sort of signal loss, chopping off bits basically, because you're not going through a set of converters, right? We're able to keep it as digital information that way, go out of the sampler, digital on your computer, do your edits, digital out on the computer, back to digital on the sampler. So that would be the way to do it, and then a little bit more real time. But if you don't have those digital outs, SDS has been around well before we really even had these digital connections out there. So SDS, like I said, it's slow, but it's an exact, and we're going to have an exact copy of it. SMIDI is based on that same idea. SMIDI stands for SCSI Musical Data Interchange. And it basically does the same thing as SDS, but it actually sends the samples through the SCSI cable. And this will take a matter of a couple seconds instead of several minutes within there. So much more efficient, but again, we're keeping an exact copy, one-to-one, every bit for bit basically is going to be copied within here as it is, without any signal loss, loss of dynamic range, cable noise, anything like that, anything else like that would be introduced here. So that would be your SMIDI. And then most of the newer devices nowadays have some kind of flash memory. So smart media cards, compact flash cards, those kind of things, which load up much, 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 much quicker than these floppies that have to spin and all this kind of stuff. And not to mention the amount of space. We can typically hold gigabytes on here. They could, we could probably recall everything off that flash drive in the matter it would take us to, maybe recall a couple floppies within there. So much more efficient as far as its load times, but also being how much more physical space or how much storage space we can put in a physical thing like a flash drive, right? A fraction of the size of this, but has, hundreds of times the space on here. So, all right, so we got flash memory on most newer devices, and also a lot of the newer devices oftentimes will have a USB connection. Sometimes this allows you to plug flash drives in, but most often what it's used for is sort of a direct connection to the computer. Even the MPC you guys have in the lab room has flash memory, has compact flash cards right on the front you can store things on, but also has a USB port. And if we take that MPC and basically plug it in with a USB cable to a computer, the MPC mounts up like a hard drive. It just sort of shows up and it's like, hey, you plugged in an external hard drive. It's called the MPC. So we can take any audio files from Logic, anything on a computer, literally drag and drop it to that MPC. Now they pop up on there just like a hard drive would be. So really easy ways to move our samples that way as well. Like I said, it just sort of pops up. You just drag and drop it over that drive, and now your samples are on that actual piece of gear. So like I said, most of the newer devices using that flash memory and USB out there. So. All right, now really that's kind of the hardware devices all continue with this method of the RAM thing, right? And with all of our hardware devices, for the most part, we consider them all static, meaning the complete sample is loaded in the RAM. So based on your sample rate and your bit depth, you can do the math. Like I said, it's roughly 5 megs a minute mono at 16-bit 44.1. Stereo is obviously going to be double. That'd be up to 10, right? And essentially, that's how much time you have. If you got 32 megs of RAM, do the math. You're looking at 5 megs a minute mono, so maybe 6 minutes, right? Yeah, so that's right. 6 minutes sampling time, basically within those 32 megs. That's it. That's the top, right? If you try to send 35 megs in there, you got to delete something to basically fit within there, right? We can't basically exceed that limit of 32 megs of RAM in there. That's our hard limit. That's how much space we have. That's it. There's no moving around that number. Hard limit, that's what we got, right? Now, pretty much all of the software samplers have adopted a new method, all right? And this product, the first product to really introduce this was something called GigaSampler. I'll show you what it looks like a little bit later today. And I remember it came out, and it was, their first instrument was a 1 gig large piano, right? And it was like, you buy this one instrument, and it was called Giga Piano, using this GigaSampler that was 1 gig, really realistic, great sounding piano. And at the time, everybody was sort of like, wait, it's a gig, but I don't have a gig of RAM. Nobody has a gig of RAM. You're like, man, I paid like 256 megabytes of RAM. I paid like $600 for that. How's this GigaSampler going to fit in that? There's no such thing as a gig of RAM at the time when this came out. So what they utilized was the streaming method, where the attack phases of all the samplers, right? So just the first few hundred milliseconds of all the samples across every key, multiple velocities, all that kind of stuff, are loaded in RAM. But just those first few hundred milliseconds. The rest of the sample is basically streamed from the hard drive. So since these attack phases all load in RAM, right? As soon as you press a key, cool, that sample's in RAM ready to play. While it's playing that first few hundred milliseconds, it's going to find the rest of the sample on the hard drive, do a quick seamless crossfade, and it basically switches over to playing it from the hard drive. So this means our samples can be any amount of time at this point, right? We're only limited by our hard drive size at this point. The RAM really doesn't determine how many samples we can load within here. And like I said, this is a very revolutionary product. It only ran on Windows when it first came out. I know a lot of people that ran all Mac-based studios literally bought out a Windows computer just to install this one piece of software on there. Audio MIDI interface to it, basically still running on their Mac, but literally almost treating that whole computer like a hardware device. It was literally just that revolutionary. Since then, of course, there's Mac support for it. Logic libraries actually load specifically that Giga format, and pretty much all the software samplers have all sort of adopted the streaming method. And again, with our computer too, our RAM is going to be used not just by our sampler. We got RAM that's used up by our operating system and Logic and all these other things running on our computer within there. That RAM has got to be shared within there across multiple programs, multiple plugins, all that kind of stuff within there. So very revolutionary. And like I said, pretty much all software samplers have all kind of adopted that method. Like I said, all we have to do is just have the attack phases in RAM. Those are all ready to go. So any key that I press, immediately attack phase ready to go. And then it just basically does a quick seamless crossfade. I've never heard this crossfade, so it's really smooth. And it just basically switches over to playing the rest of the sample from the hard drive. We could literally have a DJ set in here, right? And all it's got to go in RAM, just that basically start of that first few hundred milliseconds. And also, as you guys have probably quick feed files on your hard drive, right? Even though it takes some time to maybe start it, usually once that song starts, it doesn't stop. It knows where the rest of the song is going, and it usually isn't, unless you're having problems with your computer, cutting out in the middle of the song. Hold on, right? It knows where everything is sort of at within there. All right, so very revolutionary, and like I said, pretty much all software samplers, the ones in Logic, Kontakt, all utilize this streaming method here. All right. All right, so our basic sampler hierarchy, right? So we're going to have these sort of layers that we'll have within a sampler instrument. And even as we look at, say, something like a drum kit, right? That drum kit, we're going to have sort of layers within here, but we're going to have a bunch of unrelated samples. So I'm going to have kicks, I'm going to have snares, I'm going to have hi-hats, I'm going to have toms, right? All these different kind of things within there. So look at our hierarchy, we're going to sort of look at that as still an instrument within there, right? So at the top level, we'll have this program or instrument. Sometimes it's also referred to as a bank. And an example of this might be something called a vintage drum kit, right? We're going to have that program that's going to have a kick, and it's going to have some snares and toms and cymbals and all that kind of stuff within this one usable program here that are a bunch of unrelated samples, right? Other than just being drum sounds to make our drum kit, really they're individual things and not really related, right? It's not like, hey, here's the snare, 4 different pitches of it, like you might be doing with other pitched instruments. All right, so in the program or instrument, we're going to have what's called zones. Somehow these zones are called multi-samples or key groups. And Logic specifically, you have 2 kinds of zones. One is going to be the key zone, and one is going to be things like velocity zones. So key zones, for instance, if you wanted, even though we're going to go kick, and then we got maybe a snare, then we got a different snare, then maybe in the next 6 keys, we want to put toms across there in multiple pitches. We could essentially kind of set a key zone within here and say from F to D, all the way across there is going to be the zone, right? And if I put one sample in that zone, now I'm going to hear different pitches of that tom played across those multiple keys, right? That would be sort of our key zone. We set from a high and a low. Cool, sample's going to play within this active range within there. And then the other thing, like a velocity zone, would be something like to create something like a rim shot. Hopefully you guys all know what a rim shot is. Right, typically when drummers sort of hit the rim and the snare at the same time, and it gives that sort of popping sound. You guys know what I'm talking about, hopefully. Rim shot, all right? And you might even notice even going across some of the acoustic kits, that's sort of set up within there, right? You'll notice if you're playing one of the acoustic kits, you hit a velocity of 100 and you hear snare. You see it snare. And then you hit like 120, it goes pop, and you hear that sort of rim shot within there. So how that's made is just basically they take in multiple samples of the snare drum, and then they get the drummer to do a rim shot. They put a velocity zone in here that just says, all right, cool, 120 to 127 is going to play the rim shot, right? 119 to 1 is just going to play the normal snare. So you hit the normal snare, and now as you're playing, you want a rim shot in there, whack that at 120 velocity, you're going to hear the actual sample change out, right? And actually play that. So oftentimes they're related, but typically, like I said, it's going to be something that'll give us some extra dynamics within there. And most organic, acoustic, even electric instruments, it's not just a volume difference with their velocity, right? You should notice sort of a brightness thing happens. If I hit a piano at a higher velocity versus lower velocity, a real piano, like we hear more hammer, right? It's much more percussive. We hear kank, kank, versus you hit the piano at a lower velocity, slower speed. It's kind of like bling, bling, warmer tone, not as bright, but not as much hammers in there too, right? So most instruments sort of respond that way. Brass instruments, right? Higher breath pressure you put in there, the instrument gets brighter, right? Less pressure, less sort of a velocity as we equate this to keyboards. We're going to hear more of a warmer tone and not quite as bright, not quite as cutting through within there. So typically we can use these sort of zones with velocity zones to emulate pianos, brass instruments, guitars, all those kind of things. When we dig in, those instruments can get a little bit brighter, and we'll give you a lot more realistic instruments, right? The contrast to that piano would be things on like the Casio Portatone home keyboard, right? Even though it has velocity sensors maybe within there, they're just changing volume. You're not really hearing any tone of the piano. It's playing that same piano sample regardless of what velocity you're playing within there, right? But a really good piano instrument is going to have multiple velocities within there, so you can hit it and you're going to hear it's going to sound like that warm, not bright, not percussive tone of our piano at a lower velocity. Higher velocity is going to get brighter. You're going to start hearing much more percussive. Those hammers go gank, gank, actually hitting within there. So but again, all the more we can make much more realistic instruments here by having different velocity zones in there as well. And don't overlook that, especially if you're taking like samples of real instrument. You always want some different velocities within there, because almost all organic acoustic instruments respond differently. It's not just a volume difference. There's typically a tonal difference happening in there too. That's even why we see so often filter cutoff mapped to things like velocity, even with our synths. That was kind of emulate real instruments. With a higher velocity makes these instruments brighter. Right? And then inside the zones, whether it's key zones or velocity zones, that's where we're going to put the actual samples. Right? These would be the actual audio files. Once upon a time, these were all proprietary. You know, EMU had different formats from Akai, had different format from Roland's, had different formats from Sonic. But at least the sample file format nowadays is all pretty much the same as our computer with waves and AFF files. So that's a great thing. Everybody's at least kind of come together on that. Typically still mappings as far as the actual programs within there. Those are unique to Kontakt versus, the sampler and Logic versus Mach 5 or anything else within there. But at least the audio files, we can take something that you just recorded in a Logic, right, as a WAV or AFF file, trim it up, drag it right in the sampler. Same file format. We don't have to convert. That used to be quite a big process. I will tell you, if you've grown up with these hardware things of, cool, I'm going to send audio from an audio interface into the sampler and have to record all this stuff out there. So it's a much, much easier process nowadays with at least the same file format. And again, be able to take that WAV file and just drag and drop it to the MPC, plugged in as a hard drive, right? Now that sample is now in the MPC. But again, WAV, FF file, standard audio file formats nowadays. So it's a great thing they've at least all support the same file format there. So. All right, and another way to look at this, there's our vintage drum kit, right? Inside of the vintage drum kit, we got the zones. Inside the zones, we got our samples within there. And this is how it's going to look in Logic, right? Here's our sampler, the Logic sampler. Within there, you can see I've got some zones, right? So notice it has the actual graphically sort of, as well as text-wise telling me in there. This sometimes displays the wrong octaves, and this has to do with Yamaha and Roland Stainers that we'll get into a little bit more next week. But that's kind of why we see the discrepancy here, where you will see if you're looking closely, the key says C1, but the text says C2. So that has to do with that setting in there that, like I said, we'll talk about more next week. And then inside of there, you can see under file, we've got the actual sample within there. All right, so the whole thing is a program. Inside the program, we're going to put these zones, key zones and or velocity zones, right? You can actually see to the right of the key zone, it actually says velocity 0 to 127. So that's where we limit that to. If this was a rim shot, we might set the velocity to now be 120 to 127. We put our normal sample of our snare, maybe 1 to 119, right? So 1 to 119 plays a normal snare, 120 to 127 plays a rim shot, right? So we can sort of customize this, set this up within these zones as well. Right? So key zones and velocity zones, and then inside of those is where we're going to load up the actual samples. All right, next thing, a couple tips, tricks, things to sort of look out for when you're recording samples. And a lot of these will apply to just general digital audio as well. So should be useful across the board, sort of. So, but first off, we're always going to record using a healthy level without clipping, right? And like I said, this typically means, you want to ride it as hot as possible without hitting 0. If you do hit 0, you've missed something, right? Basically, the amplitude went out of our usable range, and that's why it clips off, and you miss something out of that range. So if you clip, you need to turn it down before it gets to the A to D converter, right? That might be on the mic preamp, that might be on your trim into the audio interface, but you want to basically, maybe that even means moving the source or the musician further from the microphone, right? That would work too. But in some sense, if we're clipping, we miss something, we essentially need to trash that and grab that sample again without the clip, right? Just a little bit of clipping, we've missed something. That's what that clip kind of indicates, is something went out of our usable range and out of our recordable area. So you essentially need to turn down your input. And like I did say, though, if you're recording at 24-bit, healthy level might be -18, -12, somewhere in there. And that's fine. But big point with this is the lower the bit depth, the more important we need to ride these things up to 0, right? A little bit later today, we're looking at some vintage samplers and things that have kind of come in through the years. And, we obviously started off with 8-bit sampling and 10-bit and 12-bit sampling, and then eventually moved up to 14 and then 16-bit. So there's definitely some older devices out there that you might come across that definitely have a sound to them too. So a lot of people like those sounds and use some of these specifically for that sort of color that's added within there. So, but just be aware, the lower your bit depth here, the more important it is going to be to ride that up to 0. If we're using something at 8 bits, we don't have a lot of dynamic range, right? Literally 8 times 6, you're looking at 48 dB dynamic range. So if you're recording your samples at -12, your usable sample is 36 dB dynamic range. Not much, right? But again, if we try to ride that up to 0, you want to maximize, be able to use that 48 dB dynamic range that you've got, be able to utilize that all that you can. All right, so the lower the bit depth you're dealing with, the more important we want to ride this up to 0. But healthy level means basically hot, right? We don't want it to not clip, but we want this to typically be as loud as possible. Utilize all the dynamic range basically of that A to D converter within there. Right? Now next, you want to always record more than you need. You can always trim these things out, but again, it's just like sort of the count-in thing, right? We don't want to not have a count-in and hit record play. And that's sort of the same thing we'd be dealing with here. If you got your sample all queued up and you're recording on your computer and you're like, all right, record play. You can be missing the attack, and the attack's probably going to be the most important thing to trigger the beginning of that sample every time, that you don't want to miss that. So always record a little extra, a little bit at the end, a little bit at the beginning, extra. If you're getting a drum beat, I grab at least a beat or two before, beat or two afterwards. That way you can sort of trim this stuff up, and you're not going to be like, oh, man, I was so close, but I missed just a very bit of attack there. There's nothing you can really do to undo that, right? You essentially just got to record it again there. So always record a little extra at the beginning and the end. Like I said, we can always reclaim that sampling space, but you want to have a little extra as opposed to not having enough when you miss something, right? Then your sample's not going to line up and all that kind of stuff within there because you're not getting the attack on, right? So, all right, next thing, I want to edit our sample start and endings. That's what's called zero crossing points. Right, this one I'm going to go to my whiteboard for. Anybody know about zero crossing points? Heard of zero crossing points before? All right. So I assume you've all looked in at a waveform at some point, right? Hopefully you zoom in on some audio somewhere and it looks something like this, right? If you see a bunch of Christmas trees, right, keep zooming, and eventually everything looks like a bunch of sine waves, right? Kind of the heart of additive synthesis within here, right? All right, so, and understand too that this basically our 0 volt line is that line in the middle, and that represents silence, all right? And when we see these positive voltages, it tells our speaker to push out. When it sees negative voltages, our speaker pulls in, right? So this positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative means push, pull, push, pull, push, pull, right? Like I said, this is literally just as our speaker sort of traces voltage to push and pull to create sounds as it happens fast enough past, 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second, all right? So what do you think would happen if I took a cut here, right? Just up at this big amplitude in here. So imagine what I'm telling my speaker to do. We're in a state of rest, setting at silence, and then not ramping up at a frequency, but I want it to instantly jump up to this maximum amplitude from a state of rest. What do you think that's going to sound like? Think it's going to sound nice? Or some of you guys might
not
even...
so good.
Yeah, not so good, exactly. Because again, we're telling it to jump up here, and every time we play the sample, it's going to make a pop or a click. It's going to every time we play the sample. So what we want to do is edit our sample at 0 crossing points, right? So again, what that means is we want to edit here, or here, or here, or here, or here, or here, right? Anywhere we're basically intersecting with the 0 volt line. Because now if I do a cut, right, let's say we do the cut here, we're not telling the speaker to instantly jump up to this maximum amplitude. I'm telling it at this frequency, ramp out to here. We're going to have this nice, clean front, not a click pop basically at the beginning of our sample in here, all right? Make sense, right? So we always just want to cut on 0 crossing points. And this is actually a function in Logic that is turned on by default, right? If you double click on the audio file, it opens up the sample editor, not the sampler editor, but the sample, basically the audio editor. Like I said, double click on an audio file. And it is on by default. If you look at one of those little local menus, it says snap to 0 crossing points and has a checkbox next to it, right? So if you try to cut here in Logic by default, it's going to be like, you mean here? You're like, no, I want to cut here. It's like, you mean here? And it's going to jump and snap to the near 0 crossing point, giving you nice, clean edits. Generally, that's a great thing, right? Yeah, we don't want any clicks and pops in there, right? And some of you guys might even heard the click and pops with something like the synth. Well, yeah, let's get back to that in just a second, all right? So let's say at some point, though, you're dealing with a bass, right? Bass is going to be higher or lower frequency? Lower frequency, which is going to be shorter or longer wavelength? Longer wavelength, right? So at some point, you might find yourself needing to make a cut here. You're like, all right, I want to cut here. And Logic's like, you mean here? And you're like, no, I mean here. You mean here? And it's going to snap to that 0 crossing point. And the lower frequency we're dealing with here, those 0 crossing points are going to be spaced much, much further apart here, right? So Logic is...
I have a question.
Sure.
That's something you have to enable in Logic?
It is actually turned on by default.
Okay, cool.
Yep. So it should just automatically do this for you. But I bring it to your attention because anytime computers are doing anything automatically for us, sometimes it's going to get in the way. And there's always some exception out there where like, man, no, I don't want this on. And this would be sort of that case here. If you need to cut here, you need to cut here, and you've already decided you need to cut here, but Logic's like here, 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 here. So I'm bringing this to your attention because you can go in and uncheck it, right? Now we can actually make a cut here. Now we've created a problem because we got this pop, right? Because we're going from this instant jump up from state of rest up to maximum amplitude. What can we do to get rid of that? There's a different solution that will sort of fix for us. There's two things that will sort of correct this for us. All right, let's go back to the synth project. Anybody remember when you're making your synth project? Maybe you made like a self-oscillating kick drum with a sine wave, and you might have heard the clicking happening within there. Every time you hit your kick drum, it's like, Actually, not every time. It might be a lot of times, but it's different amounts every time. Because basically, we just got this free running wave in there, right? It never knows when you're going to press the key. Sometimes you press the key where it's 0 crossing points. Less likely, because we got a lot more room where it's off, right? But a lot of times, you're just going to basically be hitting it off the crossing. And you're hearing it click, 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 right? It might be like click, 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 different amounts of click, because like I said, different points of amplitude are off here. So if you did that in the synth project, what did you guys do to fix that? Anybody do anything to fix that? What could we do? What could we do with our envelopes? Change. Yep, release it with D at the end. What's going to be at the front? Longer attack. Exactly. Because like I said, within your synth project, this is sort of what was happening where you might have heard that on your kick drum with these clicks in there. All we did to sort of release, to get rid of that was we made a little fade in here, right? A fade in, or we raise the attack time that now allows us to have a smooth fading in of that hard transient within here. And now we're going to have a nice smooth attack there, right? So raising the attack, or if you're hearing clicking at the end, we could change the release as well, right? So that would be one solution. And then the other file-based solution would be to just go ahead and do like a fade in on this audio file. If we did a fade in where that comes in, that's going to sort of do the same thing as raising that attack. So it's 2 solutions like that. So like I said, sometimes you'll want to cut on that 0 crossing point, so you might need to uncheck that. Like I said, most of the time computers trying to help us out, but sometimes they get in their way. And this is sort of one of those times it might be in a way that, no, I don't want to cut there. I need to cut here. This is what I need to do here. Stop getting in my way, Logic. Turn off 0 crossing points. Now you can cut wherever you want. Now you've got a pop, but now, like I said, we could do a little fade in across the front there, or raise the attack on your envelope. And either of those solutions is going to sort of fix the problem there. So, all right, cool. So that's our 0 crossing points. Cool. All right, so next thing we got here is truncation, right? And truncation, I think best way to define truncation is the inverse of cut, right? So imagine if you typically make a selection of your audio file and you hit like cut or delete, it gets rid of your selection and keeps everything else, right? So truncation is sort of the exact opposite of that. We make our selection, and when we hit truncate, it gets rid of the beginning, gets rid of the end, and leaves basically our selection. So like I said, typically when you're cutting, it's getting rid of your selection. But if we're in truncate, it keeps our selection and gets rid of everything else. So like I said, literally inverse of cut. Does the exact opposite. All right. All right. So truncate also sometimes called top and tail, right? Because you're editing the top and the tail to sort of clean up the sample to, this is my usable sample, and I'm going to have right here in the middle. Which usually you'd have some silence, or, whatever you grabbed before, and then find out where the end is, or where it's sort of just going to loop around. All right. Now, as we're going to create a sampled instrument, all right, there's something we need to set essentially for a reference point with any other kind of instruments we might ever use if we want to have some sort of reference to know what these note values is going to be, right? And this is going to be called the keynote or root note. Either word is acceptable. These 2 terms are generally really interchangeable. The keynote or root note. It's going to be the note number where a sample plays back and its original pitch and speed. Did I say pitch and speed? I did. So with what we're talking about today, traditional digital sampling, changes in pitch will equal changes in tempo. All right. There are ways to do one without the other. It would be called time compression expansion. Basically, it will change your tempo without the pitch. And then we've also got things like digital pitch shifting that will change the pitch without the tempo. So there are processes to do that. Those are typically used to be offline processes. Now, of course, we got things like Ableton. They're able to sort of do these in real time. But there are always sort of artifacts in quality within there. If we're going to try to play something faster or slower and change the pitch, or vice versa, we're going to have to sort of stretch things out. And there's going to be holes as you sort of time compress something or expand it. We're going to have to remove information, right? So like I said, those are a little bit more of destructive processes, more often file-based processes. But what we're talking about here is we're just going to basically be playing the sample faster or slower, right? Just like a record, like a real record, right? You put it on the different speed, right? DJs out there, if anybody ever DJ'd, right? The pitch controls are also your tempo control. Those 2 things are essentially locked together, right? If you're dealing with traditional records. Of course, like I said, I get that there's all these digital, tractor and all these kind of digital things that can do one or the other. But with traditional DJing with records, right, the pitch controls were basically the tempo controls. That's how you beat match basically with those pitch controls. So same thing here. These 2 things are locked together. So as you play things higher up the keyboard, We'll hear higher pitches, but we're also going to hear the tempo get faster, right? As I play things lower down the keyboard, we're going to hear the pitch go down, but it's also going to be longer tempo-wise, right? And it is the case that if we recorded like an F in here, let's say we had a drum loop and a pitch in there, right? A flute, something together. If I play one octave up, we're going to hear one octave up, right? Because it's going to double the frequency. It's also going to double the tempo. You're playing in double time. If I play the F below everything, we're going to have that frequency, which gives us the octave below, and it's also going to play in halftime, right? So same kind of deal in here. Now, the great thing, we don't have to know all these things in here. As long as we set this keynote root note, the sampler does all the pitching for us. If I set this up and I play, 3 semitones higher, the sampler knows, all right, cool. I'm going to play the sample that you put in here. I'm going to play it 3 semitones higher, right? 1/12 of sort of the doubling basically happened within here. So we don't have to calculate any of the math, anything like that. But it is critical that we set this keynote or root note, all right? So let's say, let me just create this scenario for you, and I think this will become really apparent why we need this keynote root note set. So let's say we got a sax player, right, in the studio, and we're like, hey, you playing sax, right? Can you give me some samples? We're obviously going to clear this with them. Hey, we're making a sample library. It's cool if we take some samples, your sax. And like, yeah, sure, whatever. You're paying me to be here, so whatever. Well, I'm here. All right, so they give we're like, cool, play a note. And they play a C. And you're like, all right, cool. All right, awesome. Put that C in here, right? And maybe I don't even ask. I just say, hey, play a note. And they're like, all right, and they play a C. All right, cool. So I take this C. I put it in my sampler. And I just put it in here like we're looking at here with the F. And I say the keynote root note is an F, right? So that means every time I play this F, we're hearing what? What pitch are we hearing every time I play this F? We're going to hear the sample playing back its original pitch and tempo, which is the note of a C, right? So that's definitely going to be a problem, right? And honestly, while you're just dealing with the sampler, everything's going to be cool, right? But then you're like, all right, cool. Let me load up a piano track and add some piano on here. Cool. I'm going to play F. Whoa, that is not an F. Whoa, what key are we in right now? Right? So, like I said, this is the one thing we sort of got to tell it to have some compatibility with as far as pitch instruments with any other instruments basically within there. We need to essentially take note of, all right, hey, sax player, what note are you playing? All right, cool, you're playing a C. All right, cool. Hey, let's write that down. Maybe we should name the region here, put it in the notes, take a notebook, I don't know, but write down that that's a C that you recorded, right? If you don't write it down, you got things like tuners. You can always bring tuners up to look later, or have, a piano instrument in there and be like, what note did he actually play on here? Oh, that was a C. All right, cool. Let's set the keynote root note to be C. All right, cool. Now when we hit a C, we're going to hear the C. And if I've got a big range set up on here and I hit the G, we're going to hear the pitch of G that we expect to have in here, right? It knows all the other math to basically make everything work around there. But like I said, we got to set this keynote root note just to be able to have compatibility with those keys actually meaning something, right? Otherwise, everything is just going to be transposed by however amount you're off. So you got a tuner built into Logic. So if it's past the session, load up that tuner. Or just load up, electric piano instrument and be like, is that the F? Is that the C? What note are they playing here, right? Hopefully you got good enough ears to be able to know what notes they're playing. Set that as a keynote root note. And once you set that in there, that's sort of the compatibility and the standard that everything else goes around there. And the sampler knows, if you play an octave up there, it's going to play twice as fast, octave up. Play an octave below, half speed, octave down. And everything else in there, like I said, all the other semitones, it knows all this math to calculate that. We don't have to do any of that. But the one thing we got to set is this keynote root note to be able to say, all right, cool. This recording was an F, and we need to tell this an F. And when I hit this F, that's going to play the original recording. I can play around it. Now it's going to make all these other pitches for me. Right? I will say, keep in mind, though, as we play higher up, like I said, tempo is going to increase as well, right? Which is going to make samples shorter. So keep in mind, if you took a sax, playing like 1 second, I guess that's about a second. When you play one octave up, it's going to be half a second. And when you play 2 octaves up, that sax sample is only going to be a quarter of a second. So what your is now going to be, or it's more going to be, all right, so just keep that in mind. The other thing, too, if any samples are recorded with LFOs, things like vibrato, right? If you got vibrato on a key that you add within there, as we play that sample up higher, the vibrato is going to be faster. So it's like, and then you play really low, and it's like, wow. Right? So typically, you are going to try to grab your samples without any kind of vibrato, without any kind of LFO stuff happening in there. And then you can typically just add that to the sampler instrument, right? That way, regardless of where the sample's playing back its original pitch, we're going to add the vibrato afterwards. That way, it's going to be consistent vibrato all the way across the keyboard, regardless if we're playing these samples faster or slower, higher or lower, right? We're going to have consistent vibrato as we'd expect. That's probably what you want most often. Maybe you want different rates, but like I said, just keep that in mind. If you got any tempo synced LFOs, those go completely out the door once you start playing different pitches within there. All the LFOs are going to be running faster and slower because there's changes in pitch and tempo.